all here again. Before I let Ido begin the morning session, I just remind you that we have 2 more sessions this morning. Then we have another lunch together downstairs, the cafeteria. You already know the place. And after lunch, we'll have our last meeting, shorter one, titled Concluding Discussion. We hope more about a discussion. I don't know how much we can conclude, but the hope, at least, is that we can have a last session where we talk a little, try to reflect on the last days, and say what thoughts, ideas come to mind, what we can see, also maybe forward-looking. And the last reminder is that this evening, the second event of the week will start, the conference dedicated to Dehan, 100 years to his assassination. And the opening part, the opening session of this event will take place at the cinema Babylon Mitte, which is in Rosa Luxemburg Platz. It will begin with a screening of a new documentary film made by Zvi Lanzmann, who will be also there. Afterwards, there will be a discussion with Zvi Lanzmann and Dori Manor and Oded Schechter on Dehan's literary work. You're all invited. And Ido, please.
Okay, so I'm happy to open the next to last formal session of our conference, which will be more or less dedicated in many ways to the work of our friend Danny Boyarin. We have 2 speakers, Shaul Magid and Annabel Herzog. I will introduce Shaul, and before Annabel speaks, I will also more elaborately introduce her. So Shaul is a visiting professor of modern Judaism at Harvard University and senior research fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard. His latest book is The Necessity of Exile, Essays from a Distance, published by Ayin Press, 2023. The title of his talk today will be Nationality and Diaspora Nationalism, reading Daniel Boyarin through Louis Brandeis. Shaul, please.
Thank you, Ido, and thank you for everybody for coming this last day. I have 2 prefatory notes before I begin my talk. One is kind of genesis of how this happened. I was, some months ago, contacted by Ephraim Taburi, who's one of the editors of the Journal of Contemporary Jewry, who asked me to write a review of Danny's book, No State Solution. And I had already read the book right when it came out, and I also had read Julie's review in Jewish Currents, and I read Ishai Ben Rosenzvei's review in Haaretz, and a couple of other reviews. And I wasn't sure if I really had anything new to say. I liked the book very much, but I couldn't figure out if there was anything that was worth, the words on the page. And I wrote him back and I said, I don't, thank you for the invitation, but I don't know really what to say, anything that hasn't been said. And then at the same time, I was teaching a seminar at the Divinity School at Harvard on American Judaism, and one of the things that we were doing was reading a series of essays by Louis Brandeis from 1915 to 1917 on Zionism. And I suddenly realized, strangely enough, that Danny and Brandeis were actually talking to each other. And so I wrote Ephraim back and I said, well, I don't really want to write a review of the book, but if you're interested in a comparative essay between Brandeis and Boyarin, I'd be happy to do that. And he graciously said, okay, so this was what I came up with. And the second thing I wanted to say is that I said this to Danny yesterday. I think a lot of the criticisms or pushback or resistance to the no-state solution is that people don't really read the subtitle, which is a manifesto. And it really is a manifesto. And manifestos are it's a certain genre of literature. And they are interventions, radical interventions, and they are by definition unrealistic. Because that's part of the critique, I think, of many, is that, well, this no-state solution is not really realistic. There's a state. What are we going to do with the state? What does it mean to talk about a no-state solution? And the response that I always give is that there was another bearded Jew in 1897 who wrote a manifesto in Vienna, and a few decades before that, there was another bearded Jew who wrote a manifesto in London. And Danny's manifesto is no more unrealistic than either one of those manifestos in their time. So the idea of it being not realistic in speaking about a manifesto isn't really sustainable in my view. So it is a manifesto, and I think we should treat it as such. By the early 1970s, there was much talk, certainly in America, about what was called then a Zionist consensus. This consensus had numerous precepts. First, much of the ambivalence about Zionism in some sectors of American Jewry dissolved with the baby boomer generation, the first generation of Jews, most of whom were born in America. Dual allegiance no longer threatened Americanization as it did in the progressive era. Many Jews in the New Left were able to be radicals and Zionists. Think, for example, of the Radical Zionist Alliance, Dissent magazine, the Jewish Liberation Journal of that period. Second, after the impending fear and later jubilation of the war in 1967, many diaspora Jews, certainly American Jews, resonated with the famous quip by Commentary magazine editor Norman Podhoretz in the early 1970s when he wrote, "We are all Zionists now." Thus began a concerted educational project in the United States in Jewish day schools and summer camps and synagogues that taught that Jewishness and Judaism should be seen through two interlocking themes, Zionism and the Holocaust. This continued unabated until the 2000s. In the 80s and the early 1990s, with the settlement project in full swing, combined somewhat ironically with the de-demonization of the two-state solution. Remember, for example, that Edward Said was demonized in Jewish circles for daring to even support tacitly a two-state solution. We entered into what I'm calling a liberal Zionist moment, a belief in the possibility of a resolution to the unsolved Arab question. That was the Arab question from the 1920s that had been sidelined with the Holocaust and the apparatus of the new state. And it was this liberal Zionist moment that has doggedly remained as, quote, the only solution to Israel-Palestine. I'm not agreeing with that, I'm just saying that's how it's portrayed. Institutionalized in organizations like J Street, even when it has become not only unrealizable, but even undesirable for a majority of Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. But something has changed in the last few years. Perhaps the nation-state law in 2018, the Israeli elections in November 2023, two states has been increasingly becoming utopian rather than pragmatic. To speak of the transition from occupation to annexation is no longer forbidden. And the siege of Gaza after the election of Hamas in 2007 created what now some see as the prelude to October 7th. The atrocity, the shock, and the humiliation of October 7th for Israelis and the devastation of the ensuing war in some way served as the match that lit the pile of dry brush that had been accumulating for decades, the flames of which pushed many in Israel to the, quote, there is no solution other than a zero-sum game solution. And the alternative in the diaspora, interestingly, in some sectors, to rethink the entire viability of the Zionist state project. Thus, I submit in the diaspora, especially among young Jews, we may be witnessing the transition from the dying liberal Zionist moment to an anti-Zionist moment. What is meant by anti-Zionism is not completely clear. It's certainly not the theological Zionism of the ultra-Orthodox or the assimilationist anti-Zionism of classical reform from mid-century. It is not, as I read it, necessarily opposition to the existence of the nation-state, but rather a serious reconsideration of an ethno-state whose very existence seemed to be founded, perhaps preternaturally, on the domination of the non-Jewish minority. of the non-Jewish minority. In addition, this new anti-Zionism seems to be equally rejecting Zionism as the sine qua non of legitimate Jewishness, in some way a process of de-Zionization of the diaspora that took shape in the 1970s. It is in this moment that I want to examine some of the premises of Daniel Boyarin's book, The No-State Solution, as an alternative way for Jews to envision life in the diaspora that is in some way a companion to Nono's recent book on Tzfat and the Mishnah as an alternative model of dwelling in the land of Israel. The no-state solution does not give birth to this anti-Zionist moment as much as offer one articulation of its unfolding. I engage Boyarin here in a somewhat idiosyncratic manner, as a way, in one sense, to diminish its radicality, and in another way, to accentuate its contextual viability. I do this through viewing him through the lens of Louis Brandeis, who is one of those prominent American Zionists of the 20th century. I do so by comparing Boyarin's particular notion of diaspora nationalism and Brandeis's notion of nationality as a basis for Zionism. If some of you don't know, I think there's some strange irony that, because I said it to Amir, that Jacob Frank's name somehow was evoked a couple of times, and that Brandeis is from Jacob Frank's family. So in some bizarre way, if there is or isn't a God, she certainly has a sense of humor that one of the most recognizable Jews of the 20th century America is a descendant of Jacob Frank. I engage Boyarin here. Boyarin published The No-State Solution, a Jewish manifesto, in 2023, an anti-Zionist argument for diasporism. In it, he suggests that Jews are best served not by a Jewish nation state that is an ethno-state, that becomes, in his view, by definition and not circumstance, chauvinistic and domineering, but by a diasporic national identity where Jews can flourish as Jews by doing Jewish things together and part of the fabric of a broader multicultural society. Critics such as Julie Cooper, in her review in Jewish Currents, have suggested that Boyarin is offering a new form of diasporic nationalism sharing some qualities with Simon Dubnow, which Boyarin would agree, who was not an anti-Zionist per se, but promoted an alternative theory of Jewish collective existence outside the parameters of statehood. But whereas Dubnow's diaspora nationalism was Eastern European and its languages were Yiddish, Russian, and German, Boyarin's diasporic nationalism intends to be global to include Jews wherever they live. The no-state solution is an intervention, a manifesto into the present conversation about Israel-Palestine or Palestine-Israel. But it's not only that, and this is an overlooked element of the work as I see it. A two-state solution, a one-state solution, a binational state, or some type of federalism or confederacy, or a one-state reality are often proffered as solutions to the present crisis. Boyarin argues that perhaps the problem may be the structure of the nation-state itself. That is, why is the nation-state as an ethno-national state the best way for Jews to flourish as a collective? The question is not new. Anti-Zionists and anti-nationalists since the 19th century made similar arguments. But Boyarin's argument is different because it is not historical but prescriptive. He wants to offer a non-state alternative to Zionism, not a history of opposition to Zionism. But unlike some other prescriptive alternatives, such as Judith Butler's Parting Ways and more generally Anthony Appiah's Cosmopolitanism, Boyarin's program is not cosmopolitan. That is, it's not assimilatory or universalist in any simple way. Boyarin's argument is deeply invested in Jewishness, what he calls Judaite, a term that extends beyond religion and belief, a deep identification and investment with an identity constructed from the plethora of the Jewish experience. He finds ample resources for such a notion in Black studies in the form of negritude in the works of Frantz Fanon, Emme Kassir, and others, and in part as a response to anti-Blackness and colonialism, negritude seeks to re-own Blackness in the fullness of its existential experience. It is Blackness forged out of its negation. We needn't go into the details of negritude and Boyarin's Judaite as a surrogate for Jewishness. Suffice it to say that what is important for our purposes is that Boyarin seeks to construct a new kind of non-statist Jewish nationalism resembling the fullness and non-statist vision of negritude. It's not the nationalism of Dubnow's autonomism. that contained institutional and political structures for Jews to live safely in the diaspora, that was largely unsympathetic to them. Dubno, while not a Zionist, was sympathetic to it. But for Boyarin, as I read him, this is really not necessary in a world where most Jews live in democratic countries where they're free to be collectively Jews. It differs from blacks who still live in countries of systemic anti-black racism, and surely for Palestinians who live in the Jewish state, or states more generally, because states more generally for Boyarin are brutal and violent entities. And the Jewish state, he continues, follows suit. Can we say that his anti-Zionism is a particular expression of his anti-ethno-nationalism more generally? Critics from the left have argued that Boyarin's claim to nationalism is itself a weakness of his argument, and yet that seems to be precisely what he wants to do. To argue for a kind of nationalism that's not statist but supports a particularistic form of collective life, as opposed to statist nationalism and equally opposed to cosmopolitanism. There are those who Boyarin does not cite who make the distinction between states more generally and a Jewish state, supporting one and opposing the other. For example, in his 1892 essay, The Messianic Idea, philosopher Hermann Cohn, and Daniel deals with that as well in his book, believed that states were legitimate collective structures for Gentiles, but not for Jews. The reason, he argued, Cohen, was because it was the Jews who carried the Messianic idea, an idea which required the Jews until the end time to remain stateless and reside in the states of others. States, Cohen surmised, would eventually become obsolete. He writes as follows, and I'm quoting Cohen from 1892. Indeed, the coming of the Messiah is predicated not on the flourishing of the state, but on its destruction. The people must be made to understand that they will be ready to receive the comfort and consolation commonly regarded as properly messianic functions only after they have lost their statehood. Cohn wants to live outside the state structure in order to retain the message of an end time when states will disappear. But Boyarin is not, as far as I know, a messianist. His argument is that living in the diaspora, especially one where Jews are free to be Jews, enables them to develop a broad sense of Jewish expressions that would and should transcend former religion, a term that he does not think adequately captures the Jewish experience, as he argues in his book, Judaism. And statist nationalism, certainly the ethnocentric variety, includes all the political obstacles of domination, immorality, and violence that plagues all states. So Boyarin seeks a collective consciousness of what he calls diaspora nationalism that moves beyond Dubnov's autonomism and Zionism's statism. And here I come to Brandeis, a seemingly unlikely interlocutor, precisely because both he and Boyarin write from America, from different sides of a century, and share an optimism about the possibility of a diaspora where Jews can flourish. Of course, as we all know, Brandeis was a Zionist. He viewed Zionism precisely, or even primarily, as a way for Jews in America to construct their collective identity, while Boyarin views Zionism as the problem of Jewish identity. But a Jewish state was not really a reality for Brandeis, as we'll see. He envisioned it quite differently than the state that actually does exist. Boyarin struggles with an ethnocentric state that has now become a state of domination, a state that Brandeis arguably would not have supported either. There are various essays in which Brandeis explains his Zionist vision, perhaps the most comprehensive in an address he gave in 1915 in New York City in front of the conference of the Eastern Council of Reform Judaism, entitled The Jewish Problem and How to Solve It. I want to note 3 points of context that I think are necessary to understand Brandeis' essay. First, it's delivered during World War I. The War of Nations, a war that many believe should not have taken place precisely because of the establishment of the nation state. Second, it's delivered in front of leaders of the reform movements whose first programmatic statement appeared a few decades earlier in 1885, known as the Pittsburgh Platform, which unambiguously states, and I quote, written by Kaufman Kohler, this is the platform, "We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine nor sacrificial worship unto the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any laws concerning the Jewish state. End quote. Brandeis was certainly aware of the bloodshed of Europe as ethno-national states were destroying one another, and the reform platform that rejected Jews as a nation. And third, the speech was delivered in the same year as 1915 that Horace Kalin coined the term cultural pluralism as an alternative to Teddy Roosevelt's melting pot in Kalin's Democracy versus the Melting Pot. In some way, we will see, I think, that Brandeis's Jewish nationality coheres loosely with Kalin's cultural pluralism, which he was certainly familiar. All three of these things informed his advocacy of what he calls Zionism. As a final prefatory note, it's not insignificant that Brandeis titles his essay The Jewish Problem. This, I submit, is an American version of what in Europe was called the Jewish question, which generated, as we all know, for many Zionism. Both Marx and Herzl used this locution in their famous essays on the Jewish question, and both of which responded to Jewish emancipation and the challenges it posed in Europe. It was the question of if that was answered negatively, both by Marx and Herzl in different ways, that is, a Jewish question in Europe questioned the very possibility of Jewish membership in a European society and not the best ways to enact such membership. Whether there was ever a Jewish question in America is a matter of scholarly debate. Actually, Lila Cohen-Berman is coming out with a book on whether there was a Jewish question in America. What there was, as Brandeis framed it, was a Jewish problem. And that problem was not if Jews could be a part of America, but how they could best become American. The famous line in Brandeis's essay, which some of you might know, comes at the end when he says, and I quote, "Indeed, loyalty to America demands rather that each American Jew become a Zionist." End quote. To understand to understand what Brandeis meant by that, we need to return to the earlier sections of the essay. First, underlying the essay is the problem of what Brandeis calls Jewish prejudice. Perhaps we can call that anti-Semitism today. But the problem, he continues, is not necessarily eternal. It can be solved. And the best way to solve it for Brandeis in 1915 was through liberalism. Not the liberalism of the individual or the liberalism that creates a pure secular space where that's sometimes called monoliberalism, but the liberalism of the equality of the groups within a liberal society, sometimes called pluralistic liberalism. Thus, for Brandeis, the question is the equality of the Jews as opposed to the equality of the individual Jew, which in America Brandeis felt was assured by the Constitution, as Julie mentioned yesterday. But what is the form of Jewish group identity that needs equality? Here he introduces Zionism, and with it the important and often overlooked distinction between nationality and nation. Citing historian W. Allison Phillips, Brandeis defines nationality as follows. I'm quoting again. "An extensive aggregate of persons conscious of a community of sentiments, experience, or qualities which make them feel themselves as a distinct group." Unquote. Nationality is distinguished from nations, which are best, according to Brandeis, composed of many nationalities, as some of the most successful nations are. So for Brandeis, it's always comparing America to war-torn Europe. Brandeis continues, and I quote, "The unity of a nationality is a fact of nature. The unification into a nation is largely the work of man. The false doctrine that nation and nationality must be made coextensive is the cause of some of our greatest tragedies. It is in large part the cause of the present war." 1915. These comments are crucial in understanding what Brandeis meant by Zionism. First, one wonders whether the distinction between nationality and nation is a response to Kohler's comment in the Pittsburgh platform of "we are no longer a nation." Brandeis might say to Kohler, yes, Jews are not a nation, but they are a nationality. That is a collective with a common bond, history, religion, and common life and manners. Second, this may be an implicit comment on the dangers of the ethno-state, that is, the state where nation and nationality become fused. As he says, it is in large part the cause of the present war. arguably the cause of the present war today as well. Zionism for Brandeis is then the construction of a Jewish nationality that can participate as a group among other nationalities that comprise a nation. Zionism for him is a solution to the Jewish problem in America, to expand liberalism beyond the protection of the individual to the equality of the various nationalities that comprise it. And it's important to note that when Brandeis speaks of nationality, he means people or Volk or Stam. He does not mean nation state. When he speaks of a nation, he means nation state, which for him should always be comprised of multinationalities. Zionism for Brandeis is the solution to the diaspora, not by ending it, but by making it better for the Jews to live precisely because it enables them to contribute to the ongoing challenges of humanity. Elsewhere, Brandeis talks about the aspiration for a place where Jews can be the majority and thus both have, quote, self-rule that would offer other minorities equality. But as I read him, this future Jewish state would mirror America's cultural pluralism. Of course, we're taking blacks out of the picture here because they're just not included in the story for Brandeis at the time. But as I read him, this future Jewish state would have to mirror America's cultural pluralism. And he's clear that he doesn't think that Jews should move to Palestine. In the diaspora, Zionism for Brandeis is the recognition of a Jewish nationality that can be an integral part of multiple nationalities in countries where Jews reside. It is therefore not a nationalism, because Jews are not a nation. However, as opposed to Kohler, who claimed that Jews were only a religious community, for Brandeis they are a collective, whatever his country, his station, or shade of belief. So I think he wants to do two things, Brandeis, in this essay. I'm going to turn to Danny's book in a moment as a point of comparison. First, I think that Brandeis wants to liberate the Jews from an inextricable tie to religion. And second, he wants to reject the notion of Jews as a nation, but not the way Kohler does. Nations are artificial with humanly constructed borders and forms of government. They are good for humanity, Brandeis maintains, but only when they embody and represent equally the various nationalities that reside in them. When nation and nationality are fused, the natural and the artificial lose perspective, and equality through group flourishing loses to domination and the rule of the gun. When Brandeis speaks of a Jewish state, he does it in laudatory and often fantastical terms, and I just have to, this one quote I couldn't let by. He writes as follows: "In the Jewish colonies in Palestine, there are no Jewish criminals, because everyone, old and young alike, is led to feel the glory of his people." Okay, I'll let that, I won't. I do not think he envisions a state where nation and nationality are fused. That is, he doesn't envision an ethno-state, but a place where the Jews are the majority in a country of multi-minority nationalities that are treated equally. So I want to turn now to Danny's The Nation State in the same way I did Brandeis. Who is Danny writing against? That's what manifestos do, right? They write against something. Of course, as an anti-Zionist, he's arguing against the state of Israel. But as he writes, he's opposed to all ethno-national states, not just the Jewish one. But he's equally writing against the cosmopolitan of Apia, and to a lesser extent, I think Judith Butler, although she's not mentioned in the no-state solution, and in an interview I published with Danny, he basically claims that he's not really arguing against Butler. While Apia and Boyarin both oppose nationalism as territorialism, Apia proposes a universal morality common to all, while Boyarin argues for a collective moralities that each have connective minorities that each have their own roots and can participate in universal concerns. In that interview that I published with him in the Ayin Journal, Boyarin says as follows, and I'm quoting him: "I am deeply hostile to the idea of cosmopolitanism and align myself with Amy Kassira's universalism as the coexistence of many differences." In this sense, just as Brandeis was trying to offer a new approach to Kohler's Jews are no longer a nation and religion defines the Jews, Boyarin is opposing both the nation state as a solution and any form of universal cosmopolitanism as a solution to the Jewish problem. Non-territorial nationalism for him enables the collective to thrive on its own terms while remaining open to the world and its problems simultaneously. Living in late 20th and early 20th century America, Boyarin's diaspora nationalism need not contain, in my view, the political structures of Dubnovian autonomism, since contemporary diaspora nationalism is politically rooted and in many cases legislatively protective in the democratic countries where Jews live. In some way, Boyarin is rehearsing a kind of cultural pluralism of Kalin, but doing so now in opposition to the statist Zionism that has become predominant, almost doctrinal in contemporary America. It's important that Kalin also was a pre-state Zionist. Like Brandeis, Boyarin is opposed to ethno-nationalism, but Brandeis's essays rarely address the question of territorial expropriation, which in 1915 was still not really the issue of most Zionists. While for Boyarin, the fundamental problem of Zionism is that it is founded on territorial expropriation. To some extent, the problem lies, I think, in what Chaim Gans calls proprietary Zionism. That is the classical Zionist position that begins with the notion that the land, all of it, belongs to the Jews from the river to the sea, which was interestingly most recently used as a campaign motto of the Likud for Greater Israel. And the Jews can decide to share it on conditions and criteria that only they determine. Thus, for proprietary Zionists, expropriation is not even an operative category. Brandeis, for example, I think would have rejected the 19th century American doctrine of manifest destiny framed by Joseph O'Sullivan that was used to justify white Christian Western expansion in the Oregon Territory. I would add that in 1915, of course, the very notion of Palestinians didn't exist. While for Boyarin, Palestinians are a distinct and coherent collective who, as Said argued in the question of Zionism, are victims of the Zionist project. Boyarin's chapters on Zionism draw much from Chomsky's Beyond the Nation State, which argues that many architects of Zionism were not statist in principle. Interestingly, just as and I don't think this was intentional on Boyarin's part, just as Brandeis frames his essay about Jewish prejudice in 1915, Boyarin ends his book talking about anti-Semitism and anti-anti-Semitism. For Boyarin, the cultivation of a variegated culture, Jewish culture through study, literature, art, dance, and music, which can then fully participate in the larger world without many hazards and pitfalls of a nation state, especially founded on the reality of the displacement of another people, is in his mind the best form of anti-anti-Semitism. It's true, of course, that Jewish difference Boyarin advocates, even in its non-statist forms, could easily cultivate animus among the majority and other minorities, but I don't think that he really wants to present it as a solution to anti-Semitism writ large. Although there are universal aspects to the Jewish nation state, it hasn't been very good at promoting them. When Jewish political leaders define the nation state's borders as the borders of Auschwitz and describe its enemy as a Molech, when the head of the ADL, Jonathan Greenblatt, declares anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism full stop, universal potential does not seem forthcoming. That is, when anti-Semitism becomes a foreign policy, Israeli exceptionalism seems unavoidable. Boyarin ends his book with the following proclamation. If we want Jews to continue as a meaningful entity, a diasporic nation with a culture and the capacity to care deeply and struggle for the oppressed of other nations, especially the nation where we have oppressed the Palestinians, we have to make it so. That's how the manifesto ends. How would Brandeis view that sentence? I think quite positively. In fact, he may actually say that is precisely what he meant by Zionism. A Jewish nationality, not nationalism, that can be an integral part of America, not dependent on belief or practice, but manifest collective solidarity for the purposes of national success. So the differences between Boyarin, and here I come to my conclusion, the differences between Boyarin and Brandeis are many: historical context, profession, education, identity, temperament, social status. It's interesting that Brandeis' nationality as opposed to nation and Boyarin's diaspora nationalism as opposed to Jewish nation state share some similar overlaps. One wonders how much the differences between Brandeis and Boyarin are the result of living in different stations of history, but not only that. For Brandeis, arguably, nationalism was still depicted in such laudatory terms, in part because he didn't live to see the ravages of fascism in Europe. And his Zionism was so romantic and optimistic because he never saw the actual Jewish ethno-state that came to be. For Brandeis, a Jewish state was understandably still a utopian fantasy. The Palestinians did not exist as a people, and one could assume that if they did, he would argue they deserve the same rights as Jews living in the land. Whether Brandeis would have maintained his optimism of the progressive era in America in late 20th century remains an open question. But both believed in the proliferation of Jewishness outside the formal structures of religion or Judaism. One called himself a Zionist, one calls himself an anti-Zionist. But the more we examine each in light of the other and in their historical context, the less oppositional they appear. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shaul, for this talk. We will take questions later because the papers are pretty much related, and I think it will work better if we do it this way. So I will introduce Annabel. Annabel Herzog is a professor of political theory at the School of Political Science at the University of Haifa, Israel. Her research focuses on 20th century continental philosophy, exploring the connections between ethics and politics and between philosophy and literature. Her latest book, Levinas's Politics, Justice, Mercy, Universality, published by University of Pennsylvania Press, was the recipient of the 2021 Jordan Schnitzer Book Award in Philosophy and Jewish Thought. Her talk is entitled, Should Anyone Feel at Home? The Critique of Sovereignty in the Cesare's Resident Foreigners and Boyarin's The No-State Solution.
Good morning. The bad thing about speaking at the end of a conference is that almost everything has been said already, including by Shaul right now. The good thing is that one can refer to things that have been said by other people before me, so that's... I would like to thank first the organizers of that conference that is ending but exceeding all expectations. When Gilad talked to me about his idea of doing such a conference a year ago, as a conference in Haifa, I didn't exactly know what to imagine, and it was before October 7th. And now we're all here, and things make sense beyond the expected. So thank you all for putting this together. This paper, my paper, is a shorter version of an article that will appear in German in a book dedicated to the work of Donatella di Cesare, the Italian philosopher and public intellectual who teaches in Rome. She's a Jewish Roman, so maybe she's a kind of relative to Josephus. I myself grew up in Paris, France, so to already answer a possible question from Gil about geography, the perspective of this paper will also be European from inside Europe, not Western in the American sense, but European from Europe itself. The paper was planned and almost written before I knew that Daniel would be at that conference. And when I heard he would, I wasn't sure I should give the paper. But anyway, Donatella is not here, but both she and Daniel already read the paper, so there's no surprise here. They read it and responded, so I feel okay. In this paper, I use sovereignty in the sense of territorial power, and I discuss critiques that challenge or dismiss the sovereign aspect of nationalism. I focus on two books, Donatella di Cesare, Resident Foreigners, A Philosophy of Migration, published in 2017, and Daniel Boyarin's The No-State Solution of a Jewish Manifesto, published in 2023. Di Cesare's book doesn't focus on Jewish politics. She has a book on the State of Israel, but it hasn't been translated into English, and my Italian is not good enough to read it. But she offers, in her book, she offers a phenomenology of migration that criticizes liberal democracy's reaction to the contemporary flow of refugees and migrants, as well as the state-centric stance of liberal philosophy. Her phenomenology aims to formulate a conception of non-autochthonous citizenship that resonates in a way with Jessica's paper of 2 days ago. Boyarin's book redefines Jewish nationalism as independent of any territorial affiliation, particularly the land and state of Israel. It's a plea for a diasporic politics that would, in the same move, be national and promote universal social justice. Although both books have very different objectives, they converge in their arguments against the sovereigntism of closed borders and territorial nationalism. In my view, their distinct analyses are similarly grounded in a phenomenological conception of being at home, individually and collectively, that is not tied to a specific place or land. As such, a parallel reading of Cesare's and Boyarin's books raises questions about the political significance of a home not founded on territorial sovereignty. And it reminds me what Atalia said about being at home in a decolonized way. What kind of political life can be envisioned for non-autochthonous citizens, as Cesare puts it, or a national group in the diaspora, as Boyarin puts it? I first summarize the gist of their arguments, and then I examine their use of Jewish sources, and in particular, their use of the Bible and the Talmud as models of being at home. Finally, I wonder about the political meaning of their models, and I argue for a return to sovereignty as to the only tool of emancipation. So in Resident Foreigners, Cesare analyzes recent migration processes in Europe. Migration is not a new phenomenon. However, migration patterns shifted in the second half of the 20th century, with Western Europe becoming a key destination for post-colonial refugee and labor migrations. In this context, Cesare condemns the policies of a Europe that has turned its back and hardened its heart against migrants and refugees attempting to reach its shores, and she formulates a critique of state sovereignty. Cesare's critique extends beyond exclusionary state laws to target Western philosophy, and in particular, trends in liberalism that embrace territorial sovereignty. Her main focus, I'm sorry, Menachem, is Michael Walzer's communitarianism, which, she argues, provides a comprehensive sovereignties perspective that tacitly supports exclusionary politics. According to Cesare, the liberal arguments for the right to exclude rest on two myths: the social contract and land ownership. These principles, she argues, hold little value against the dire realities faced by those fleeing disasters and persecutions. However, Cesare also critiques liberal cosmopolitans who advocate open borders based on freedom of movement. She accuses them of reducing migration to mere individual mobility and ignoring the crucial issue of reception. In effect, liberal cosmopolitanism depoliticizes both the causes and the effects of migrations. Boyarin's purpose differs from Cesare's. His book, The No-State Solution, explores Jewish identity, rejecting the necessity of a sovereign state for Jews. His argument hinges on the concepts of diaspora and nation. Following the other scholars, and in particular Nono's work, he deconstructs the Zionist narrative that posits that for 2,000 years, Jews only waited for being again sovereign on the land of Israel, as if political sovereignty on that land was the only situation in which the Jews could fulfill their Jewishness. He argues for a different Jewish consciousness founded on the notion of diaspora, not exile, as a new political conception of Jewish life that would be more than what we have today. More just, sorry, than what we have today. Not difficult. This inquiry into the Jewish political identity leads Boyarin to the concept of nation. He argues against Judaism being a religion, which he regards as a system of beliefs in the Protestant way, and claims that the Jews constitute a social entity. In a move supposed to be unexpected for a left-wing thinker, he calls that multi-faced entity a nation, namely, quote, a collective that shares language forms, historical memories, ancient and modern literature, stories, and customs. Such a collective is based on kinship or family-like connections that create genealogical relationships rather than geographical ones. The Jewish nation is a national community imagined not in space, but in time. An echo with Eshel, maybe. As such, its social processes and practices can be defined as a nationalism unrelated to any kind of territorial sovereignty, and in particular, unrelated to the State of Israel. What is interesting is that both Cesare and Boyarin articulate alternatives to sovereign power using Jewish sources. The Cesare draws on her interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, while Boyarin relies on his understanding of the Talmud's role in Jewish cultural and spiritual history. And this reminds me something that we said during the discussion of Gilad Sheinav's paper, the difference between the Bible and Talmud. In Resident Foreigners, the Cesare examines Heidegger's phenomenology of habitation, and she explains that Heidegger identifies two relationships to habitation, which are flawed when taken separately. One is the perspective of, quote, those who are convinced that they are already at home, solidly rooted in the native soil, in a sure belonging and unshaken identity. The other consists of, quote, an errancy that knows neither route nor destination nor return, end of quote. For Heidegger, as we know, locality and journeying are interconnected. To further explore this claim, de Cesare turns to three ancient models derived from philosophical, mythical, and historical sources: the Athenian model, the Roman model, and the Hebrew model. In de Cesare's analysis, the Athenian political culture is one of autochthony, in which the community of citizens considers itself as being, as a whole, ancestrally connected to the soil of the city. Such a permanent presence to a geographic origin, unspoiled by immigrants, foreigners, or slaves who could never become part of the demos, constitutes a myth of political purity in which being born in Athens, maintaining a bloodline, being a citizen, and being at home are synonymous. The Roman model, by contrast, is the paradigm of a city absorbing foreigners who, together with the natives, shape the political community. Rome's expansionism led to the creation of a juridical citizenship separated from the location of the city. It is the third model, however, the biblical city, that de Cesare's phenomenology promotes. She relies not on historical sources, but on her own interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, which she regards as the foundation of the Jewish collective imagination, and on the deconstruction of presence initiated by the philosophies of Heidegger, Levinas, and Derrida. As de Cesare sees it, the biblical narrative defines a constitutional right and a public law, thereby establishing a political regime or Hebrew city, which can be compared to Athens and Rome. She begins her discussion with an extraordinary assertion, quote, the Jewish landscape is inhabited with figures of peerless and familiarity. The lead character is the foreigner knocking at the door, the ger. What is unusual here is that the central figure of Jewish culture and Jewish politics for de Cesare is seen as the foreigner, ger in Hebrew, rather than the Israelite. In her reading, the biblical law does not promote any essential antithesis between the foreigner and the Israelite citizen, and this for two reasons. First, the Hebrew word used in the Bible for foreigner, ger, is built on the root that means inhabit. The foreigner is therefore literally he who inhabits. More precisely, we should say, The foreigner to whom the biblical law refers in relation to the Israelite citizen is a foreigner who lives in the same place as the citizen, the resident foreigner. This has nothing to do with history and historical legitimacy, but it's her way to see it. As the Cesare emphasizes, quote, through this immediate linguistic connection, the foreigner is tied to inhabitation, and inhabitation is tied to the foreigner. This contradicts any logic of autochthony. Secondly, the resident foreigner constantly reminds the citizens that they themselves used to be foreigners. Indeed, the biblical narrative emphasizes the peregrinations of all Israelite characters, and it includes a recurring divine order to remember that you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. God even bluntly states that, quote, of the Bible, the land is mine, you are but strangers resident with me, putting an end to the, quote, illusion, quote from the Cesare, the illusion of belonging to a place for the Jew no less than for the Ger. The Cesare elaborates on the Hebrew's existential situation of strangeness and on the fact that the foreigner's residence is never put into question. The foreigner has a right to stay, and she must be protected at all times. The Hebrew political home, therefore, deconstructs the grammar of us and them, structurally divided between the citizen and the resident foreigner. The biblical home is open, conscious of the possibility of exile and of its own vulnerability. As the Cesare argues, quote, the Ger is testament to the fact that another habitation is possible. She attests to another relationship to the earth, with the earth, and corresponds to another way of being in the world. For the Cesare, such a home is the most fitting model for the current situation of mass global migrations. What the Hebrew model suggests is a concept of cohabitation, namely a reconsideration of space thanks to hospitality. The ethics of space that the Cesare promotes is not related to identities, but to our most fundamental relation to being there, which is made of unfamiliarity and precariousness. Therefore, the Cesare posits that being home means, quote, stepping back a little, moving aside a bit, namely making space for those who arrive. In the no-state solution, Boyarin emphasizes that his rejection of a nation-state for the Jews comes together with the rejection of all nation-states. He asks, what if nations do not have to take the forms of states? This reconsideration of the meaning of nationalism is, however, the new Jewish question. Its answer, therefore, will deal with the Jewish existential model. Boyarin focuses on the Jewish experience or Jewishness, which is a collective performance expressing and creating cultural connections among Jews, independently of particular places. More precisely, the performativity of being Jewish is foundationally diasporic. It has a non-territorial essence. Why is Jewishness fundamentally diasporic? Boyarin contends that its practices are centered on the tradition engendered by the rabbinic literature written down in the early Middle Ages, namely, quote, on the Talmud and its language, a common linguistic culture in any language that differentiates us from the other folks with whom we share space and local languages, end of quote. For him, the core of Jewishness consists of the Talmud as a structural behavior and experience that go far beyond the written book itself. The choice of the Talmud is the origin of Boyarin's argument in favor of a diasporic understanding of Jewishness. Indeed, as he reminds us, quote, the Talmud was produced in diaspora, end of quote. And this means two things. The first historical and the other sociological. Firstly, the Talmud was redacted in Babylonia. It constitutes the outcome of the reflections of diasporic rabbis and reflects a diasporic perspective. And he says that the Jerusalem Talmud here is not very relevant, and maybe the Mishnah is not relevant either, but that's a question. Secondly, the spiritual and social culture is independent of its setting. It's a system based on and constantly generating communal interactions, collective and individual behaviors and rituals, methods of writing and of dialogue, shared narrative, mythology, proverbs, and jokes, etc., which can flourish anywhere and have no need for territorial sovereignty. In sum, Boyarin's claim of the diasporic essence of Jewishness is the result of the following syllogism. Jewishness is Talmudic, Talmud is diasporic, hence Jewishness is diasporic. Note here the difference between this view and that of the Cesare. The Cesare takes the Hebrew Bible to be the heart of the Jewish experience, and from there she conceptualizes a citizenship internally challenged and divided by foreignness. Boyarin focuses on the Talmud, which is an experience wholly generated by foreignness. Put differently, the identity created by the Talmudic landscape is inherently dissociated from citizenship. Wherever citizenship exists, it has no relationship whatsoever with Jewishness. The Cesare understands Jewishness as the constant experience of the impossibility of autochthony in a specific place. Boyarin sees it as a radical non-citizenship. For any given Jewish individual, what may be connected to citizenship in his person is her individuality, her human beingness, not her Jewishness. Since, moreover, the Jews are a nation, citizenship and nationhood belong to two completely different spheres. On the level of citizenship, a Jewish person is an individual associated with this or that political community. But in parallel, she is part of the Jewish nation, which is a social dimension of existence constructed independently of states and territorial entities. Being at home Jewishly consists of a geographic homelessness, not in the sense that one would have no house or country to live in, but in the sense that houses and countries have nothing to do with Jewish sociality. To express this complementarity of one's cultural home with one's situation in the world, Boyarin mentioned the Yiddish term Doikat, literally here-ness, used by the Jewish socialist movement, the Bund, before World War II. Doikat expresses the Jewish commitment to, quote, fighting oppression of all those who are so oppressed where I live, end of quote. Therefore, by contrast with the Cesare, who defines being at home as a political rearrangement of our use of space, Boyarin defines being at home as a set of social attitudes based on a genealogical tradition, which have an impact both on Jews and on the people with whom Jews live. Therefore, for the Cesare, being at home is synonym of cohabiting, of hospitality, and it reminds me what Saïe said about cooking or sharing food in her home. My cooking is not as good, but you're invited to. For Boyarin, however, home is a set of social practices related to time via tradition and genealogy, together with a care for the well-being of all peoples. In both cases, the proposed model is presented as a political option that is more moral than its current alternative. The Cesare believes that a non-sovereign, anarchic citizenship will prevent the exclusion of migrants, refugees, and other stateless people. The conception of Talmudic culture as the only home of the Jewish nation allows the Jews to focus on their moral vocation, which is to care for universal social justice. It opposes the crimes of the State of Israel. But which political regimes would realize the Cesare and Boyarin's models of being home? How would political institutions regulated non-autochthon citizenship would like? What is political in the cultural life of Jewish diaspora? As Julie Cooper notes in her review of Boyarin's book, surprisingly, Boyarin does not give any indication whatsoever about the practices of a political autonomy that should organize Jewish communities. Now, it is perfectly clear to me that his endeavor focuses on conceptualizing Jewishness rather than on formulating a new political theory. But since his book presents itself as a political alternative to nation states and territorial sovereignty, it would be good if it included at least the basic political elements of this alternative. However, when Boyarin summarizes his model of Jewish nationalism, he says, quote, "No more federations, councils, leadership committees, sociologists who study Jewish continuity by counting babies and checking out their mother's identity. Just Jews singing, dancing, speaking, and writing in Hebrew, Yiddish, Judaismo, learning the Talmud in all sorts of ways, fighting together for justice for Palestinians and Black Lives Matter." To me, it seems that here Boyarin steps outside politics and simply supports an ideal version of North American cultural hybridity. In a similar way, De Cesare's Resident Foreigners fails to explicate the political practices that citizenship qua hospitality would engender. Clearly, her phenomenological inquiry is not meant to propose normative guidelines. However, for her model of home as moving aside to be more than a metaphysical position, it needs to generate a set of rules or socio-political devices through which deterritorialized citizenship would acquire a phenomenality that affects reality. My concern is not that we are left with no practical directions to follow, but that in both cases, the very idea of political devices is rejected. This contradicts De Cesare's and Boyarin's claims of proposing new political perspectives on the situation that they analyze. Additionally, their lack of political imagination weakens the impact of their moral arguments. As Derrida's work shows, ethical models cannot be realized without socio-political structures that enable their implementation. While it is true that in the real political world, ethical models can never be achieved in their absolute purity, outside of the political realm, they cannot be realized at all. Ethical models need the phenomenality that only politics can provide. Moreover, in their shared rejection of sovereignty, De Cesare and Boyarin do not appear to value democracy. However, beyond its exclusionary effects or in parallel to them, democracy also serves as a tool of emancipation. While the welfare of refugees and Palestinians, to combine both books' concerns, is of utmost importance, it is equally crucial that all human beings, whether as individuals or collective, have the right to live free from domination and oppression. Democratic sovereignty, both territorial and popular, enables people to achieve emancipation, not in an absolutely perfect way, but in a continually perfectible manner. It is fashionable to discredit democracy, but when democracy has totally disappeared, we will all miss it dearly, including migrants and indigenous peoples. It seems to me that the diasporic culture promoted by Boyarin necessitates a democratic environment wherever it exists. But if this is the case, some form of sovereignty is needed. However, if some kind of democratic sovereignty is needed in the United States and in other countries where Jews reside, it is also required in what is called today the State of Israel. It is undeniable that the definition of that state should be completely transformed to grant all its inhabitants emancipatory rights and enable them, all of them, to live free from domination and oppression. Such urgent and necessary changes do not imply a rejection of sovereignty, but rather a re-evaluation of how that concept is applied within the historical and geographical context of the country. I do not mean to suggest, even for a second, that Jewishness is inherently tied to sovereignty in the State of Israel, but rather that if Jewishness is in any place concerned with emancipatory rights, it must engage with sovereignty in some manner. And sovereignty doesn't mean a nation state, and it doesn't mean ethnocracy or ethno-national states, but a certain relation to power. Put differently, Boyarin's conception of a home in time rather than in place necessitates the fundamental assurance of its continuity, democratic sovereignty, wherever nations reside, including Israel-Palestine. Contrary to the Cesare's and Boyarin's position, I contend that sovereignty erases only a portion of ethics and is essential for implementing another aspect of it. How can oppressed people be assisted without structures designed to combat domination and oppression? Without borders, how can any place serve as a shelter against domination and oppression? Therefore, my point is not about ensuring the cultural cohesion of a community or of an identity, but rather about safeguarding the well-being of everyone, including migrants or members of different communities. What is lacking, I think, in both the Cesare's and Boyarin's books is an acknowledgement of two things. First, the inherent incompleteness of all endeavors to achieve pure ethical ideals, alongside the recognition of the ethical, albeit incomplete, role of democratic sovereignty. That being said, their provocative arguments possess the high, very high merit of reminding us that political systems ought to be guided by ethical aspirations, and that sovereignty should not be viewed as a claim to a territory, but as the embodiment and guarantee of universal emancipation. Thank you very much.
Okay, we don't have a lot of time for questions, so I would be grateful if you can be as brief as possible. I think we will take 2 or 3 questions and answer them, okay? So I think Danny deserves the right to be the first.
I don't grab things.
The mic will grab you.
What I want to say, I think both papers were more than fair assessments or descriptions of my thinking. But I do want to say, Annabel, that I think you've conflated me with Cesare in the final, certainly in the final sections of the paper. I'm not opposed to sovereignty. I'm not arguing for a kind of stateless system. And I'm certainly not opposed to democracy. I just would like to see it tried somewhere. But what I'm opposed to is the association of sovereignty with the nation. So in the same way that I'm splitting, successfully or not, between nationalism and the state, I also want to separate between the state and nationalism or even nationality. And in that sense, the description is not unlike Shaul's account of Brandeis, right? So that's one thing I want to say. The other thing I want to say, and I'll try to make it equally brief, is the argument is growing out of an American space of cultural autonomy or cultural pluralism, because despite my dreams, we're not going to have a reconstituted Ottoman Empire or Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the possible spaces within which my vision of Judaity can exist are exactly as, again, Shaul pointed out, democratic spaces that are already hospitable. So the argument is somewhat different in the sense that it's an argument for a reconstitution of the robustness precisely of Jewish cultural life, a robust, thick life of the Jewish collective within such spaces that is not under the thrall or indebted to one of the more vicious models of nation states that currently exist.
Okay, thanks. And now Gil, and then Adi, and then you will answer, okay?
Thank you. These were really great papers. I appreciated the hyperbole of putting together Carl, Theodore, and Daniel. But I don't know that I would necessarily would bear the Jew, but let it be. The question is that the relation to power that is articulated in those three manifestos is very, very, very different. Marx argues that the proletariat needs to transform, right? That the dynamic, the dialectic is transformative, yes? Herzl doesn't recognize a transformative dialectic, but simply takes out the Jews, and as you pointed out, I think yesterday, doesn't, or someone pointed out, the point is not to establish a state, the point is to join the empire, yes? But to take Europe out of Europe so that one can be Europe. So there is a kind of dialectic, yes, that also works by separation, but also by conjunction. Same with Marx, separation and conjunction. It's Aufhebung, it's a question. With Daniel, there is a rejection of the state, and as I think Annabel just showed, there is a letting, and I actually thought, Daniel, that in the book you said, I'm against states. And now you're saying, I'm not against the state, I'm just against a particular state.
Against the nation state.
But that, my point, in fact, is that you advocate the separation between nation and state. Yeah. And so my question, because I do have one, is
to Shaul?
It's actually to both of you. I'd like to have an account of something that, of course, cannot be spoken about without being called an anti-Semite, and that is Jewish power. Power. Is there such a thing? Right? Because in Daniel's account, I don't grab things. I don't want power, which is fascinating. Yes? Because I wouldn't want to say that we live in a Foucauldian orthodoxy, but I'm under the impression that power is a little more complicated than something that one can say, I want it or I don't want it. And so, what is Jewish power? Does it exist? And Shaul, I think the question is particularly to you, but I really welcome it. For years that I've been living in this absolutely mad country called the United States of America, I've been hearing about the Jewish lobby. I've heard, or I feel that I've heard much less about the weapons lobby. And I'm under the impression that the budget of each of those two lobbies is of a slightly different magnitude. I don't want to resume power to weapons, but I would like to understand, is there such a thing as Jewish power, and what is it? Where does it come from? How does it play out? Is it Norman Podhoretz who did it when he joined the White House? Or is it something else? And I don't have an account. And I'm not getting an account from Daniel because he just goes, I don't want it. Okay, great. And I'd like to know what it is. Is there such a thing? Are we now, as it seems we are, in the age where the protocols of the sages of Zion have become true?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, stop right there.
So
Someone said I was getting
Exactly. Yeah, that's the difference. Yeah, Gil is definitely right. They have become two. I want to suggest few things. One is that what Daniel wants for the Jews, every group of people deserve. Every group of people, even if it does not exist right now, can have its own EK. Just add the EK to whoever are. And I think this is, I mean it seriously. And every group of people with its own EK deserve the mean to have the mean to accomplish, to practice their collegiality, familiarity, nationality. I don't mind how you want to call it. So this is one remark. The second is that the beautiful state that is not a nation state somehow tends to create nations and becomes a nation state of its own creation. And the nation state, which is Israel, has created the Jew as a nation of the nation state. It did not exist before. So it's in the state and not in any spontaneous or, I don't know, fateful mechanism of nations or nationalities or however we want to call it that generates the devastation of the nation state. This is what states do. And this is what the United States, with its many, many nations, have created with the, whatever is the name of this, supremacy, Christian supremacy, whatever it is. So this is the second thing. And since I think one must move their discussion to the state and not to the nation, because nation, in whatever form, is after all an ideological construct, and the nation is the most powerful, one of the most powerful agents of creating or generating or managing and proliferating ideologies, and we have to move to the nation. And I think that the serious questions that Annabel posed, I think one must admit that we don't know how to answer them today, yet. But these are the questions that have to be answered. So it's not, this is not about saying this is impossible, but this is what must be thought.
Thanks. I think we have enough to work with now, right? But I do want to take another round of questions. So you answer now, and then we'll have another round. Yes.
You can start. No, okay. Oh, wait up.
You're losing seconds.
Okay, I'll
Start.
Thank you. Really great questions. I think I want to throw, Gil, I want to throw your question, your general question, as a question to your question, which is the question of the secular and power, the relationship between power and the secular, and whether there is an inextricable tie between secular and power, and if that's the case, how does one think Jewishly about power without exiting the, I don't know what the opposite category of the secular would be, into that realm? And I think that, in a certain sense, brings me to the relationship between exile and power. Does exile require powerlessness? Is it constitutive of exile? And is there authentic Jewishness outside of exile? So that, in a sense, what Zionism does in acquiring power means that it has to reject exile. And in rejecting exile, what price is paid? And in some sense, I think one could say, as an elevator pitch, that Zionism is the product of Jews simply giving up on exile. We're tired of waiting. We don't want it. We're done. It's too hard, which may be understandable in the 1880s in Eastern Europe with pogroms. But what it's funny because as you were saying this, I was thinking of a YouTube clip that has gone around of Rav Soloveitchik from the late 1950s, where he said the success of Israel will be how Jews deal with power, and it's too early to tell what will happen. As a Zionist, he was saying that, and in the excuse me.
Now we know.
Now we know, right? And this was, by the way, this was the liberal Zionism of David Hartman and Yitz Greenberg in the 1980s. How are Jews going to deal with power? So yes, now we know, and maybe it's inevitable that's the case.
There's a definition of power that's completely associated with the state, which is necessary to criticize. But these are not the only accounts of power we have.
Yes.
I think that was Annabel's point.
Right, exactly. So the question of the Jewish lobby, as opposed to the Jewish lobby, which sees itself as invested in Jewish interests, what if the Jewish lobby saw itself invested in justice? And that would be an exercise of power that would, I think, conform much more to Daniel's position. I'll stop and I'll come back, but go ahead.
Okay. Daniel, I will first answer to what you just said to me. I think that maybe my problem is that I took your book very, very seriously. Really, I did. I really did. I'm not saying it's a joke, but it's not a joke. I really read it as I love your work and I read your work. And I'm a scholar. It's not to pay you a compliment, just to say I'm a scholar and so I read text and I take them seriously. So in your book, there is no analysis of democracy or sovereignty. And you even have sentences against sovereignty, and you don't refer to democracy. So as a scholar, I see it as something missing from your analysis. So maybe it was for you taken for granted, but in my reading, it was missing. Now, something else, and here I will add a criticism of what I already did. You just said that your cultural sphere is the United States. And as a French and an Israeli, I always have a problem with that. I'm married to an American guy, so I know how it works. And I'm sorry to say that Judaism and Judaité and Jewishness and whatever is not confined to the United States and Israel. There are other places, and there's a whole tradition, and you know that. Obviously, you know that. Your old book describes that, but your book describes it historically. But when you talk about today, it's totally American, and today it's not only American. Okay, okay. But I want to say, yeah. In any case, I want to say something about to Gil about Jewish power, and here in a way, I agree with Boyarin totally. I mean, in the sense that I don't think that there is something that is Jewish power. I mean, that power would be Jewish. Power is power. Power has no national identity. Power is power, and so if you look at Jewishness in a non-American or non-Israeli way, not defined by America or Israel, you start to think that power can mean something totally different that is not American and not Israeli. So there's a reflection to make. There's a thinking that has to be made about how should the Jews use power. But that's another question than the question that asks is there a Jewish power? It's another question. So I see power as something that you use and are used by, but not as something that can be Jewish or French or whatever. And to give a short answer to Adi's comments, it was not a question, but yes, I think that for me the big question is about sovereignty. What does sovereignty mean, or what can sovereignty mean? And And instead of thinking about sovereignty in terms of identity and identity politics, which we all do all the time, all of us, I think that we should think about sovereignty, put sovereignty outside of this identity politics framework. And here I just want to say something. I will sound very, very French, but I'm okay with that. We use in America the meaning of democracy and Democrats and Republicans have a particular political meanings. But in Israel, we use the word democracy all the time. There's one word that we never use, is the one that comes from Latin, which is republica. And if we talk about democracy, we talk about the demos, and then we have to define the demos. If we could talk about republica, what the French do, we don't talk about the demos, we talk about what's in between, what Arendt loved to, I mean, the public thing. And it's not that the French have the perfect solution, far from that. But I miss a reflection, a discussion of sovereignty in the public spheres, in the in-between, between us, that is not, when this in-between is not related to identities, but to the common life of people together.
Okay, thanks. We have less than 3 minutes, I think, but we'll take just 2 more questions. I apologize to all the others who want to ask, Zahia and Jessica. And then maybe take a few minutes from the break, but try to be as quick as we can.
Okay, Annabel, thank you so much for offering a vision of anarchy that articulates how anarchy is not chaos. I also want to say, Shaul, I think there's an operative we in how you talk that still doesn't feel entirely like Palestinians are a part of the we or the audience or the vocabulary that I find frustrating. And maybe a piece of what's so frustrating is that I think there's something you do with Brandeis where, to me, to label anything about Brandeis as racist and racialist progressivism, which is like it's a perverse paternalism toward Russian Jews. It's an orientalizing view of Russian Jews that even basically authorizes the 1921 and 24 quota acts that keeps them out, as much as it is racist towards blacks, Chinese, Italians, Native, Indigenous Americans, and many others. I think there's something you have to go there about Brandeis to not want to recover. That's a comment, not a question. But I would also say, I want to know, I think about power, like I think you both have visions of power that are plural. And I think that there's something in Shaul, what you talk about, the zero sum, like to not do that. Because I think that there's a power that's about domination and a power that's about solidarity. And I think you're standing here and giving us a power that's about solidarity. That's a rejection of the security state. That's a rejection of police. That's a rejection of ICE. That's a rejection of Americanism, not only in the United States, but around the world. And so I also think that it's a rejection of seeing what we see now as like a fulfillment of the protocols. I think what we see now, it's a fulfillment of the Spanish Inquisition. I'm gonna stop talking because that, I think that to try to get to where I have a question, I'd rather just make those comments.
Thanks, Zahia.
So unfortunately, I was not Daniel's student. This is something I'm lamenting, but
There's still time.
But I know that you had many Muslim, Arab, Palestinian students. So this is a critique of our hosts not bringing one of these students. Islam Daye lives here, Dina Salami was here. I think this is very missing on stage. To read Daniel from outside of Jewish eye. This is critical, I think. Second, I think I liked both of your talks, but it's very, very, very odd that you brought back, like what I think Daniel, and I didn't read, it's a chutzpah for me, I didn't read your book yet, but I think what you are doing is cleaning up the mess. So he's cleaning up a lot of mess, and what you are doing is ignoring his cleaning and bringing back a killing machine, which is called democracy. This is a mass killing machine. Why bring it back? Like, what I think, instead of, like, let's live with this empty space that he's leaving. Let's contemplate this imaginary space that he's inviting us to. You don't have to fill the filling gaps that he's leaving. He's making space for us to reconsider. So let's take a moment. Let's take a moment of thinking about this empty space. We are not used to have empty spaces. Now we are overwhelmed with stuff. Let's just live with this. The one thing more that I missed is, of course, we think people with others, like with relations to others. So you took the book and you tried to think with other people, so to think with the book. But I would have liked, as a non-student of Boyarin, to think with other Boyarins. Like, how can we read Boyarin in relation to himself, to his, like, I'm sure you also passed through transformations. So this is what I would have liked to know from you as an introductory. I know it was, the panel is about the book, but I would have liked to see how is this book in relation to other books, some kind of movement, changes.
Do you want to start answering, Jessica? Okay. Very quickly. So, two things. First, Boyarin, as he just said, is not against democracy. So the problem is that there is no conceptualization of democracy. He didn't clean from democracy. Second, I agree with you that democracy is a killing machine, but I also think that democracy has very good and important aspects. So here we disagree. I don't, and I think that when there is no democracy, we will all feel it. We will all suffer. So that's my, here I mean, we have to agree to disagree. I'm still, or more, the more I get old, the more I think that democracy should be, in any case. As to the transformation of Boyarin, the big, I mean, I'm not going to do a history of Boyarin's work. He's here, you can ask him. But the big change or the big transformation in that new book is that he talks about nations, while years ago he was against nations. And that's the big revolution in that book, that he says the Jews are a nation, while the conversation about nation is supposed to be right-wing, and suddenly he says, hey, I can be against the state of Israel and against nationalism, the regular nationalism, and use the concept of nation. So that's the big change that I think that he does in his history, in his work that he's doing in that book.
Okay, very, very quickly. Thank you for that. And I just to go back very quickly to Gil, I think one of the ways in which there's a kind of merging of the two things that you brought up is on the divestment aspect of the protests. For students to say, I don't want my money going to send bombs over to kill people. And so you have it, and that's very much overlooked in terms of its being legitimate or not legitimate. I mean, that's a totally, from any perspective, I would think, a legitimate protest. I guess I'm kind of doing what Boyarin does with others. Is Boyarin takes his constructive project and he reads it through Paul. And he reads it through the Talmud as a way of creating a certain kind of trajectory of saying that there is here a chidush, there is here something novum, there's a novum, but that novum has precedent. And I'm going to read my novum back through a precedent. And I guess unconsciously what I did was I took the no-state solution, which certainly in the Jewish world that I live in has not gotten a fully positive reception. And it's to say there's a radical intervention here, but that radical intervention has itself a tradition. And that radical intervention even has a tradition back to a Zionist thinker. And so in a certain sense, Brandeis is for me what Paul was for Boyarin in some way, of trying to kind of create that as a way of opening up space to, as I said, I think in the paper, to diminish the radicality and also cultivate the viability.
Thank you very much. Again, I apologize to all those who did ask. Continue this over coffee.
Hello, everyone. I'm gonna slowly start the last panel of this, the last speaking, the last lecture sessions of this conference. We have another one after lunch. So we have 2 talks left. I will start by presenting our 2 speakers, after which we'll hear them one after the other, and then I will open the floor for questions. So I begin by presenting to you Anoush Ganjipour, who is a permanent researcher on philosophy at the Centre National de Recherche Scientifique, at the Jean Pépin Center, École Normale Supérieure in Paris. He's a specialist in Islamic thought and comparative philosophy. His last monography focuses on Islamic political theology, l'ambivalence politique de l'islam, Pasteur ou Léviathan, that appeared in Seuil in 21, and I think an English translation is on its way, yes. More or less. And he also edited a few fascinating volumes in last year's Politique de l'Exil, suitable for our discussions, Georges Agamben et l'usage de la métaphysique, 2019, and Monothéisme in plural et politique, modernité, sécularisation, émancipation, that appeared in 2022, where I also had the honor to appear. And I also am very happy to present our second speaker, Ariella Aïsha Azoulay, who teaches at Brown University. She teaches political theory from an anti-colonial perspective, using photography and material culture to study onto epistemological violence in institutions and technologies like museums and archives. She has some key concepts that she uses, such as potential history and unlearning imperialism. And she has developed an approach over the last decade, concepts that have far-reaching implications for the fields of political theory, archival formations, museum and photography studies. She's also an independent curator and film essayist. Her books include, I will mention the most recent one, The Jewelers of the Ummah, Potential History of the Jewish Muslim World, that appeared this year in Verso 2024. Last year appeared Collaboration, A Potential History of Photography, co-edited volume, and 2019 Potential History, Unlearning Imperialism. Among her films should also be mentioned The World Like a Jewel in the Hand, Unlearning Imperial Plunder 2, 2024, and 4 years earlier, Undocumented Unlearning Imperial Plunder 1, 2019. And also to mention among her exhibitions, Errata, that took place in Barcelona in 2019, and also here in Berlin in HKW in 2020, and The Natural History of Rape, that was part of the Berlin Biennale in 2022. Thank you, both of you, for being here, and Anoush, please.
First of all, thank you to you, Elad, Gilad, and Shaul for this fascinating gathering. Okay. As an introduction to my talk, I would like to remind you of the discrete debate that took place between Gershom Scholem and Henry Corbin from the 1950s until Corbin's death in 1978. The framework for the debate was the series of the annual lectures organized by the famous Cercle d'Aranus, which at the time brought together some of the most original philosophers or historians of religion. Corbin and Scholem regularly participated in this event, and in a quiet, constant way, both addressed different aspects of Jewish and Islamic messianism. Indeed, some of their most famous texts on the topic are the outcome of this participation. For Scholem, this is, for instance, the case of his well-known text on Jewish messianism toward an understanding of the messianic idea in Judaism, and for Corbin, the key chapter of his great book on Islam Iranian, a chapter which is devoted to Shia esoteric messianism. At first glance, there is no direct confrontation between two scholars. However, when we read their contribution in parallel, we can reconstruct a kind of silent debate between them. This is a debate revolving around the theological, political significance of Jewish and Islamic messianism. More precisely, both try to show how Jewish and Islamic traditions, through their messianic discourse, position and distinguish themselves vis-à-vis Christian political theology. Yet on the basis of this common project, Scholem and Corbin presented Jewish and Islamic messianism as symmetrically opposed. For Scholem, Jewish messianism was essentially a nationalism, whereas for Corbin, the main interest of Islamic messianism was to save believers from politics by providing them with the discursive means of a radically anti-political salvation. As I have already tried to reconstruct this debate, I don't intend here to go into the details of their confrontation. What I retain today from their debate is that Corbin agrees with Scholem on one point. Like Jewish messianism, he said, Islamic messianism is above all a theology of the end of exile, except that exile and its end are understood in two opposite senses. Whereas Scholem claims that Jewish messianism brings an end to exile in history, Corbin argues that according to Islamic messianism, it is historical time itself that constitutes an exile for humanity, and that should be brought to an end. Corbin goes even further. He asserts that in this sense, Islam is a religion entirely centered on the idea of exile. And actually, it is on this Islamic idea of exile and its political or anti-political implications that I want to briefly focus in my talk. In thinking about the idea of exile, Islamic tradition follows its usual modus operandi. It harnesses its primary but heterogeneous sources. These sources are first and foremost the Quranic discourse and Hadith corpus, of course. In both of them, the word exile is referred to as qurba. This is how qurba is defined according to the Quranic discourse. I quote a Quranic lexicon. Qurba means to be absent from one's native land and become a stranger without any trace of one's presence in the original place, unquote. However, in the same Quranic discourse, another term appears which designates a similar movement compared to qurba, but in the opposite sense. This term is hijra, or more precisely hijra ila, which means to flee or to migrate towards. One Quranic verse has particularly drawn Muslim thinkers' attention on that point. It's the verse where Abraham, the father of faith and the first guide imam of the believers, announces his death to his people in the following terms, quote, "Now I am fleeing to my Lord, inni muhajirun ila Rabbi." unquote. Muslim thinkers have indeed relied on this verse to grasp the real meaning of Muhammad's prophetic attitude when he migrated from Mecca to Medina. Their question was the following: if the prophet's attitude is a model for all true believers, then in what sense should his hijrah be imitated? Why does this hijrah mark the beginning of Islam and became a new measure for counting historical time? Then a series of hadiths helped Muslim thinkers to infer that there is a movement that is fundamental to the Islamic faith, a movement that is the very meaning of conversion to Islam, and this movement is to leave exile. To understand the direction in which the idea of exile develops in the Islamic tradition, we need to mention another source of this tradition, Neoplatonism. Let's be clear on one point. Despite the new hegemony in some decolonial reading of Islam, without having in mind different heterogeneous sources of Islam, including Greek legacy, we cannot have an accurate understanding of the development, internal dynamics, and circulation of ideas in Islamic tradition. For all Islamic metaphysical tradition has been developed through a constant dialogue of Muslim thinkers with Neoplatonism in general, and more particularly with Plotinus, and a carefully crafted anthology based on Plotinus' corpus, Ennead. From this perspective, actually, the internal dynamics of Islamic thought could be considered as the monotheistic radicalization of Neoplatonism on several of its major issues such as ontological difference, creative imagination, politics, subjectivation, or the theory of the perfect man according to Islamic tradition, and so on and so forth. However, I would claim that at the heart of all these Neoplatonic issues, which Islamic thought have been trying to radicalize, we find the issue of exile. A quotation from Plotinus perfectly sums up the ground zero of Islamic reflections on exile. Quote, "Let us flee then to our beloved homeland," would be the sounder device one might give. What then is our escape, and what will we achieve it? We will set sail as did Odysseus from the sorceress Corsi, or from Calypso, as Homer says, with a hidden meaning, I think. He did not want to stay, though he had pleasures of sight and enjoyed much beauty of the senses. Yet our homeland is there whence we came, and there too is our Father. What is our enjoy to be? What our escape? It is not one that we may accomplish on foot, for the feet bring us everywhere in this world from one land to another, nor is it one you may make by preparing some coach or ship. You must let all these things go and not look to them, but like one shutting his eyes, you must change to another way of seeing and arouse it, one which everyone possesses but few make use of." Unquote. It is indeed in this Plotinian sense that Muslim thinkers interpret Abraham's hijrah mentioned in the Quran. Muhammad's hijrah to Medina, they thought, is also a metaphor for such a journey to the existential homeland. The fact that the hijrah opens the history of Islam took a new meaning from this new perspective. Islam both would promise and require an exit from ordinary historical time. For being in the world and living in historical times is an exile. According to Islamic anthropology, Adam's fall became such an exile. To put an end to the exile, man must therefore flee the world and historical time. The Islamic tradition, in fact, seems totally haunted by this conceptual binary of exile and flight. Islamic metaphysics, Messianic thought, Sufism, ethics, Arabic literature, and even more intensely, the whole Persian literature. To be more precise, we should say that the binary of exile and flight introduces a transversal split in Islamic tradition. I'll come back to this point. But let's first see what is the difference between exile in its Islamic sense and the Christian Gnostic doctrine, which simply rejects life here below. And on the other hand, how does such an Islamic idea of exile differ from Galut? Is it true that, as Scholem suggested in his debate with Corban, Islamic messianism and its exilic thinking ultimately represent a kind of atavism compared to Jewish messianism? In other words, do they correspond to an outdated form of Jewish messianism that would be overtaken by the expulsion from Spain and the turning point of Isaac Luria's doctrine, according to Scholem? To address these questions, I'm going to briefly evoke the main thesis developed in three seminal texts of Islamic tradition, all three articulating metaphysical discourse with Sufism. Donc, the first thing, complain of a stranger exiled from homeland. The second one, a report or tale of Western exile, both written in a decisive turning point of Islamic intellectual tradition, which is the 12th century. And finally, Mullah Sadra's magnum opus, the transcendent philosophy of the four journeys, that monumental work of Islamic metaphysics, which, somehow similar to Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, aims to summarize and, as it were, to sublate the entire intellectual development of Islamic tradition. And yet, with almost the same Hegelian ambiguity, it do this summarizing. I mean, a phenomenology of the Islamic spirit, which at the same time made possible the secularization of this spirit through its theological political reading in modern Iran and by Khomeini's school. I will also come back to this point. So the first of these theses developed in these three treatises is that man has no homeland on earth. This home lies in an invisible land in a metaphysical East. Compared to this native East, the sensible land made up of matter and relationships lies at extreme distance. Here, man finds himself at the western pole of creation. What separates the two lands is not a geographical distance, but a qualitative difference between an intelligible land and a sensible one. Not only this distance between places, but also the distinction between space and time as two different extensions are specific to the Western land and not to the Eastern land. For in the Eastern land, space and time are the same thing, and there all things are co-present in a pure and absolute present time. The primary task of a Muslim, the first step in his true conversion to Islam, is to be aware of the qualitative gap between his true land or world and the world in which he lives. This is the very first level of an exilic consciousness, as we see unlike Scholem's Judaism, not Judaism as such, but Scholem's Judaism, the negation of exile cannot take for our Muslim thinkers the form of an aliyah or return to the historical land. However, as I've just said, this is only a first level in the consciousness of exile. The second level of this consciousness is to realize that a simple rejection of this world will not lead to the homeland. A direct and total return to the homeland is only possible with death. In this respect, Islamic thought of exile is opposed to the Gnostic approach to the material world, which was also the target of Plotinus in his criticism against Gnostic Christians. To put it differently, contrary to Christian Gnostics, Gnostics' conviction, Islamic thought refused to identify exile with the rejection of this word. The idea of a definite aliyah or ascension out of the word is also an illusion. Here then is the guiding idea that distinguishes Islamic conception of exile from others. The negation of exile cannot consist in an ultimate return to the homeland. It could only be experienced as an exile from exile. What does the exile from exile mean exactly? It suggests that an access to the homeland is possible not by rejecting this word, but by maintaining a kind of shifted relation to the phenomena of this word, by regarding them as epiphanies and revealing their symbolic reference to the homeland and ultimately to divine truth. For the homeland, despite its extreme and immeasurable distance, resides precisely behind this earthly world. It's a kind of imaginative space that can only be reached through visionary events. Only in this way one could carry out the exile from exile. From this perspective, the exile from exile has a clear meaning. It is living in this world as a stranger, qarib. In pre-modern Muslim history, a first consequence of such an attitude has been the rejection of politics. For living as a stranger in the world implies not recognizing any form of salvation here on earth. Seeking this salvation by human agency in history, trying to achieve it through social relationships or political power, all this leads to the forgetting of the exile and exilic conditions. They end up giving people the illusion that they are already living at home. Accordingly, for our Muslim thinkers, the exile from exile should be first and foremost the exile from politics. More precisely, the exile from the political Weltanschauung. Now, for a religion such as Islam, which from its very beginning and exactly from Muhammad's migration to Medina involved a political dimension, this anti-political approach could seem paradoxical. It's even a critical paradox for a religion that gives a pivotal place to the idea of divine law, Sharia, and the normative organization of man's life on earth. Hence, the profound disagreement between, on the one hand, Muslim metaphysicians or Sufis, and on the other hand, doctors of Islamic law or fuqaha. For the first group, implementing Sharia in the community has a clearly political significance. In other words, insofar as the public implementation of Sharia is supposed to underpin social relations between believers, to guarantee the permanence of their community, or to embody a certain idea of public order, it does contribute to the forgetting of exile. From this point of view, Sharia finally appears coextensive with man's government in the world and with the political organization of human life. Instead, for our Muslim thinkers or Sufis, the only legitimate form of implementing Sharia is when it is conceived as a set of spiritual exercises. In this case, it no longer contributes to the forgetting of exile, but becomes a means to undertake and to accomplish the exile from exile. Indeed, the exile from exile as a form of life must be prepared through four main means. The first one, initiative engagement. Secondly, spiritual exercise. The third one, guidance. And as the culmination of all, the visionary event through which, as I said, one could encounter the homeland. Among these means, however, there is one that has a quite exceptional status in Islamic thinkings of exile. I mean guidance, hidayah, or other words derived from Arabic root hada. In fact, according to Muslim thinkers, according to Muslim thinkers, both exilic consciousness and his capacity of negating exile under the form of the exile from exile entirely depend on the presence of a guide. Without a guide, no one will be able to gain access to the other world, to his homeland, and to develop this kind of true life that consists in living in this world as a stranger. Yesterday, Gil mentioned a Quranic verse from the Surah Ar-Rahman. All that live on earth will perish. كُلَّ مَنْ عَلَيْهَا فَانٍ. But this verse is always mentioned in Islamic tradition with the verse following it. All that live on earth will perish, yet the face of your Lord will remain. وَيَبْقَى وَجْهَ رَبِّكَ. Or this another verse from the Surah Al-Qasas, which summarizes the same statement. I quote, everything is perishing except God's face. كُلُّ شَيْءٍ خَالِقٌ إِلَّا وَجْهُهُ. You can hardly find a treaty of Islamic metaphysical tradition which doesn't refer to one of these two passages. In fact, they are the expression of the exilic consciousness. Their first part contains the negation of this word, but the second part mentioned the condition of possibility of such a negation. To put it another way, the negation is possible only because God's face shows up, attracts believers' gaze, and directs them to Him. In this sense, God's face is itself the primordial and the ideal guide for humanity. Every human guide, who for Sunni or Shia thinkers may be called Hadi, Wali, friend and guardian, very important term for Islamic political theology, or Imam, every human guide are a mediator of this guidance emanating from God's face. Such a human guide is himself the stranger par excellence in this world, because he has had full access to the invisible world, this man's true homeland, and is fully experiencing the exile from exile. Because of that, he has given the divine vocation to guide others along the same path. Only under his personal government, another human being can take the path of exile. According to the Quran, Abraham himself, this stranger among his own people, was the first guide of humanity. This idea of one important point is that this very idea of human guidance was the main accusation of Fuqaha against the two first thinkers, who were both killed because of this accusation. But for sure, the main theorist of the guidance and its metaphysical aspects in a Shiite framework was Mullah Sadra, the last thinker I mentioned. Now the point is that by doing that, Mullah Sadra opened up a new possibility for the Islamic thinking of exile, in a process quite similar to that of secularization. The very idea of human guidance made it possible to overturn the Islamic conception of man's exilic conditions on earth. Through such a process, the exile from politics could become a politics of exile. This is actually the operation that Khomeini and several other contemporary Shiite thinkers accomplished precisely through a new reading of Mullah Sadra's philosophy. Such an operation paved the way for them to elaborate the concept of the Islamic State. Khomeini was given the status of supreme guide, Imam Khomeini, as he's called in Iran or even in the Arab world. However, his theory went even further in the sense that Khomeini's Islamic itself would be by definition the embodiment of guidance. According to Khomeini, this is a provisional state for the time of exile. His basic argument was that political government is a necessary means for guidance and an intrinsic part of it. Such a government, Khomeini argues, does not sustain and normalize exile as other political governments do. On the contrary, it is the necessary means to provide for the whole Ummah the conditions of exile from exile. In this sense, Islamic State would constitute, and that was the key Messianic argument, a transitional government until the Messiah or Al-Mahdi comes to govern mankind himself and to lead it out of exile once and for all. Al-Mahdi, who, as his name signifies, is himself well guided by God, the best guided by God, and consequently the ultimate guide for the humanity. So this is the image, official image, part of the main part of Islamic State propaganda, according to which this is the Supreme Guide. It means that Supreme Guide with his state continue until the arrival of the Messiah, and they will give the flag of the Islamic State to the Messiah in his final revolution. Given this perspective, Khomeini was able to retrieve and integrate Sharia in his theory of a state. As he was at the same time a faqih, he drew on his authority in order to articulate guidance to Sharia within the framework of his state of exile and to structure it precisely as a state. Sharia was now the necessary normative device underpinning a governmental order which aimed to be both political and theological. But its ultimate goal was to provide for Ummah and each of its members individually conditions of exile from exile. With Khomeini's state of exile, then we see the double bind. While the thought of exile initially aimed to escape politics even by bypassing Sharia, in its radical form, it could be transformed itself into a political theology underlying the idea of a state of exile. As Khomeini or his disciples explicitly explain, this is a state of the time of exception, insofar as the last guides, prophets, or Shia imams are no longer on earth, and the Messiah, the final guide of humanity, has not yet arrived. The Islamic State is supposed to provide the universal guidance for the time in between. So just I remember as remembering similar as you're remembering Elad, similar but at the same time completely different. Every morning in our school, before starting our classes, we in a painful ritual, we should stand at attention in playground. After listening to some verses of the Quran, we had to chant the following sentence: "O God, do preserve Khomeini's state or movement," Schmittian echo. "O God, do preserve Khomeini's state or movement until Mahdi or Messiah's revolution." So that's the official sentence, ritual sentence. So as my conclusion, I wanted to make 2 points, both related to what I would call the repression or simply neglect of Islamic intellectual tradition and of its relevance, for better or for worse, in our Western reflections. The first point, a few years ago, when Giorgio Agamben finished his Homo Sacra project, I was struck by the way his project converged in the end, even in technical details, with the Islamic thinking of exile. Indeed, in the last volume of his project entitled The Use of Bodies, Agamben came to the conclusion that the only radical alternative to political theology is a politics of exile. He argues that politeia as such forms an exilic condition for human being. And then, precisely through a new reading of Plotinus, he came up with the idea that against this exilic condition, the only relevant political action would be to undertake the exile from exile. That is, an exile from the very political community and demos, by using the Greek term apodemia. So in our discussion, I tried to show Agamben how Islamic tradition had anticipated not only his solution, but above all, the predicament inherent in it. That is the reversibility of a politics of exile into another form of political theology. I'm not sure my argument completely convinced Agamben, but I'm sure that had he taken the Islamic tradition into account, he would have oriented his project differently. Because of its both similarities and differences, Islamic tradition, yes, I'm finishing. Islamic tradition has maybe something to teach modern philosophy and political thought, yet again, for better or for worse. As for my second point, it is more directly related to our concern here, and I wanted to insist on it. The conflict between Israel and Palestine today goes far beyond the conflict between two peoples over land, or even beyond the conflict between the colonizer and the colonized. It now involves both Jewish and Islamic political theologies. If we are seeking a solution, at least on a theoretical level, we have to question these two traditions together. Deconstructing both is a necessity, but I'm not sure that their deconstruction could be simply reduced to issues of state, nation, or even exile. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I know that everybody is tired, 4 days, sorry. Thank you for the organizers for inviting me. And I would like to present, a text that I started to read at the very first days of the genocide in Palestine, mainly in Gaza, but in Palestine. And it's a rewriting of a text because since the beginning of the genocide, I feel the urgency to name genocide, what we see unfolding, not to name genocide as the end of the process, but as the beginning, because I think that we have to think this genocide with the genocide in Palestine in 1948 unfolding, and the genocide of the Jews in Europe during the Second World War, and in connection to an unnamed genocide of Algerians, both Jews and Muslims, in Algeria by the French. So in his Trois Exiles, Juifs d'Algérie, Benjamin Stora describes the experience of Algerian Jews under the French rule of Algeria. The first exile is the one from the Arab world, caused by the imposition of the French citizenship in 1870. The second is the exile from the French society, executed by the anti-Jews laws of the early 40s, which I avoid to call Vichy because it's France. The third is the exile of Algerian Jews from their homeland, concluded by the 1962 Evian Accord. And yet, Stora omits the simple fact that the Jews were colonized by the French, alongside the rest of the inhabitants of the Regency of Alger. Stora narrates these three exiles like historians describe other violent processes as inevitable, with no agents or regimes held accountable for them. In other words, Stora accepts the imposition of colonial citizenship as a fait accompli. Moreover, it protects the French from having to hear their victims or the descendants of the victims naming their crimes. is reconciled with the irreversibility of the outcome. No way back, pas un retour en arrière, he writes several times, thus complying with the European enterprise of turning the world of our ancestors, the world that they shared with Muslims, into a bygone past. So whenever you heard speaking about Jewishness or Jewish something, I don't feel included. I feel belong to the world of my ancestors, which is the Jewish Muslim world. I understand these exiles differently and hold France accountable also for 2 or 3 additional exiles. The first one, that you can see a glimpse of it here, occurred as early as the invasion of Algeria in the 1830s, when the French destroyed the infrastructure of the artisanal world and the centuries-old fabric of the Jewish Muslim world. And what you see here is what is buried underneath what is called today the Place of the Martyr Square, that the French destroyed in order to create a square for democracy. So this act of destruction inaugurated our exile from our diverse modes of being Jews. Being Jew for me is not only about texts. It is not only about transmission of text. It is also about a way of being in the world. And the Jews were from the beginning the Ummah, the jewelers of the Ummah. And this is the title of my new book. This preceded this exile that I'm describing, the destruction of the artisanal world and the fabric of the Jewish Muslim world, preceded our exile by decree known as the Crémier Decree. Discussing what Storah considers as the second exile, the revocation of this colonial citizenship by France, Storah actually ignores how this exile was concluded, with another exile, this time from the realm of truth-telling, as Jews in Algeria and shortly after Jews in Europe at the end of World War II were deprived of telling the truth about what the French and Europe did to them. This was imposed as a bargain, though they were left with no choice but to accept the silence regarding the crimes committed against them. These are my ancestors. These included also the extracted consent, for example, in Algeria, to the burning of the archives in which the crimes against the Jews were written. And I'm referring to de Gaulle inviting the heads of the 3 consistories to assist at the moment of burning what they called the Vichy anti-Jews laws. These exiles from our diverse histories, from the capacity to speak in our diverse and unruly voices and languages against what Europe did, what Europe and the Zionists did to us by forcing us to become one people, the Jews, the Jewish people, is what I will try to address today. Against Storah's description of what he calls the third exile of the Jews from Algeria in 1962, which he narrates as a neutral and liberal choice between 2 identities, I relate to it as the peak of the colonial and imperial violence exercised against us. In the human factories of colonialism, people who are forced to leave their ancestors are often also forced to reconcile with their tormentors in advance and to confess that what was done to them was of their own volition. This exile of 1962 from Algeria, which brought the Jewish Muslim world to its end, was already entangled with another colonial project, the Zionist colonization of Palestine and of the diverse Jews and Jewish communities that we were. These exiles are part of a broader campaign of violence, seeking to make us and the whole world, forget that from the time of the Prophet, through the Pact of Umar, until the French colonization of North Africa and the Zionist colonization of Palestine, Jewish communities were unquestionably a constitutive part of the Muslim nation, the Ummah. innate to it and under its protection, sheltered within the category of the dhimma, part of Islamic law. We should loudly ask today, in whose interest is it to keep us apart from the intimacy of our Jewish language, Arabic, the language we shared with Muslims? When our ancestors were exiled from what became the Catholic Spain and Portugal and arrived in North Africa, they continued to speak oral dialects of Spanish, known as Ladino, Judísimo, Jaqueita. Unlike under the French bargains of citizenship and the European bargain of a state of their own, they continued to tell their stories and relate to themselves in their own language as Megorashim, expellees. They did learn new languages, as they always had, but they kept their ancestral tongues, which allowed them to tell their experience, to say we were expelled, to keep their secrets, to transmit their wisdom and resistance, to preserve their distance from the ruling powers, to uphold their religious traditions without having to praise those who expelled them or to lie to their descendants about what had happened. In these languages to which we were exiled, French or the Israeli falsely called Hebrew, which we learned not from our ancestors, but actually from our perpetrators, as if they were our mother tongues, we were born to repeat in the first person singular, as well as in the first person plural, what the colonizers said about what was done to us, be they the Zionists, the French, the German, the British, or European in general. It is only in our anti-colonial dialects that we can tell the truth of the poisonous gifts such as the Crimea Decree or the State of Israel imposed on us by Europe, normalizing the invention of Arabs and Muslims as our enemies, normalizing this invention through our bodies, through ourselves, our identities, our tongues, our memories, our histories. Thus, with our tongue cut, this enmity made a fixture of the Jewish condition. We were transformed from Europe's victims into Arabs' perpetrators. Knowing well that the extermination plans and technologies inscribed upon the bodies of the Jews, Romani, queer, communist, and members of other groups would not, alas, be the last ones, Hannah Arendt went to Jerusalem to attend Eichmann's trial. She wrote a detailed report in an anti-colonial dialect, parsing out the meaning of crimes against humanities, so that we would never forget the principle of these crimes, that we will never forget the principle of these crimes next time when we will see them unfolding in front of our eyes. The genocide we see unfolding every day in Gaza and Palestine is inscribed upon the bodies of its victims, Palestinians, while at the same time these crimes are also carried out against the very foundations of the communities among whom they are being perpetrated. Regardless of the nature of such community, a nation, a state, a village, a people, the global scale of the world, they imperiled their foundational law, which is that of human diversity. And this is Arendt's understanding of crimes against humanity, against human diversity. This genocide, as we see now against Palestinians, helps us also to recognize that emptying Palestine of Palestinians already in 1948 and creating a state to prevent their return was in and of itself a crime against humanity. Its perpetrators, those who executed it, mostly Euro-Zionist Jews, were schooled in Europe in how to become colonial agents and how to fashion themselves against Jewish diversity. In the wake of the Second World War, as part of absolving Europe of its of its crimes, Euro-American imperial powers entrusted these Euro-Zionists with Palestine through the international body that they formed toward the end of that war to facilitate the imposition of a new world order, of which Palestine turned into Israel is actually part of it. And I'm referring to the UN that was created at the end of the war. Palestine is yours, they said, by the law of the United Nations. And they thereby designated the Palestinians as those onto whom those crimes against humanity would be inscribed. With hindsight, the genocide occurring now in Palestine has been ongoing since 1948. It is entangled with the genocide inscribed on the bodies of the Jews. Both originated in Western racializing and colonizing technologies and imaginaries. With hindsight, we must recall that the State of Israel was also created with the aim of eliminating the Jews, and we heard about it from several speakers in the last couple of days, making the Jews disappear into a new kind of Jews, the Israelis, bereft of their longer histories and unruly memories. Turning Palestine into a question at the beginning of the 19th century was already the beginning of a colonial project. Entrepreneurs of empire disregarded Palestine as a world and saw there mainly resources they could exploit and extract. Turning a people into a question, the Jewish question, was also the beginning of a colonial project. Entrepreneurs of empire forced individuals and their surrounding communities to leave their ways of life behind as they begin to fashion solutions for how to get rid of them for the benefit of their interests. This kind of foundational violence, which transforms a place or people into a question, is often relegated to the past, buried underneath other waves of violence. This is why people can still call it an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, while it is a dual project of colonization of Jewish communities, diverse Jewish communities, and of Palestine. Thus, those colonized by imperial questions are socialized to forget that their struggle is not only a struggle against their immediate perpetrators, but also against those who have forced them to become the question or the solution. And as you can understand, I refuse to be the solution. My refusal to recognize myself in the identity assigned to me at birth, an Israeli, is a refusal to forget Europe's role in making us, diverse Jews, a question to which the West has the right to continue to provide solutions. It is also a refusal to forget who we were before we were exiled, so that our world shared with Muslims could be forced to cease to exist. I am a Palestinian Jew, despite the fact that today, there is no longer a world in which this identity could be reflected. It became an almost extinct species. I am an Algerian Jew, which is also a nearly extinct species. For the creation of a modern Jewish nation in the 19th century, imperial violence was first exerted against Jewish communities, different from one another and scattered all over the world, forcing them to recognize themselves in this made-up identity, which was foreign to their beliefs, practices, and laws, which were neither centralized nor homogeneous. In this way, the Jewish problem and its first solution, unification, were born. These efforts at unification were carried out through the violence of assimilation and emancipation and the prioritization of one exile of the Jews over others, with the aim of eliminating diverse Jews and turning them into something else. These efforts, however, were doomed to fail, as in the European imaginary, Jews did not disappear and persist as a problem. Christian Zionism and groups such as the London Society for promoting Christianity among the Jews, with chapters in Palestine, North Africa, and the Middle East, had already turned Palestine into a question and mobilized the place of Palestine, Zion, in the hearts of the Jews toward a political project in which they were and still being used to fulfill a role in the Christian imperial conception of the world. This Christ church, founded in Jerusalem in the early 1840s, is one example of assimilation entangled with conversion to secularism or directly to Christianity. Most histories of Zionism overlook the fact that since the early 19th century, non-Jewish Zionists from France, England, and Germany were the ones who to draw up the first designs for the colonization of Palestine by Jews who, unwanted in Europe, were destined to convert and fulfill this mission. After World War II, Europe's Jews were trained and encouraged to transfer themselves to Palestine and adopt this European project of disposing of them as their own liberation project, a project which would finally allow them to regain their human dignity, which had been crushed and wounded by Europe. By the end of the First World War, Palestine had already been conquered by Europe, partitioned from Syria, and divided as a trophy between the British and the French, partially also as punishment of Germany. The three European countries were responsible for transforming different Jews into members of the Jewish people and turning one of their particularity, not having a lands of their own, into a problem to be solved. This is how the solution to the Jewish problem started to become entangled with a solution to the question of Palestine. This is how Palestine could become a colony, a settler colony, a European project outsourced to Jews who ended up participating in solving the problem they posed to Europe and serving as the solution for Europe's fear of losing Palestine to its inhabitants who resisted its colonial power. This is how a Jewish nation-state, akin to all others, could be born, and its imposed leaders recognized as representatives of the Jewish people worldwide. At the end of the Second World War, the Zionist colonization of Palestine emerged as a solution to yet another problem, Europe's responsibility for the crimes against humanity inscribed on the bodies of Jewish men and women. Thus, Europe, evading its responsibility for the role it played in creating the Jewish question, to which genocide was only one of the solutions, and for its role in creating the question of Palestine, promised, and not for the first time, Palestine to the Zionists, on the condition that from now on, Palestinians, and by extension Arabs and Muslims, be the Jews' enemies, and that Zionists lead the crusade against them. Since the 1930s, Palestine has also welcomed refugees fleeing Europe, most of whom were not Zionist. Opposition to the creation of a state for the Jews in Palestine was enormous among the inhabitants of Palestine, as well as among the inhabitants of the surrounding countries, including the Jews who had always lived there, who feared that this Zionist state would bring the Jewish-Muslim world to its end. But this state was nevertheless proclaimed and immediately recognized by the UN, this international organization created by Euro-American imperial forces, to allow them to preserve their colonies across Africa and consolidate the new world order they presided over. In this nation-state, the nationalization of the identity for Jews was pushed to the extreme. A form of nationality which Euro-Zionists were mandated to impose on children like me, born in the human factories that emerged in the Zionist colony in Palestine, and made up national identities, Israelis of Jewish faith. A colonial identity conceived to prevent the return of Palestinians and of Palestine, and to oppose the rich and diverse histories and of Jewish communities, many of which lived within the Ummah alongside and entangled with Muslim communities. In reclaiming and embodying these almost extinct identities, Palestinian Jew, Algerian Jew, Muslim Jew, I refuse to recognize myself in the Israeli identity that was invented with the purpose of rendering impossible the return of Palestine and of Palestinians to their homeland, as well as our return as diverse Jews to the worlds of our ancestors, where we belonged to diverse communities. The Jews didn't have lands that Europe could colonize. Rather, they possessed diverse, strong group identity. Maybe, Gil, this is a kind of Jewish power, a strong group identity that they had as discrete communities, what Frantz Fanon calls ontological resistance, which they preserved and transmitted to their children for centuries through social and spiritual principles, practices, and formations. Europe sought to destroy and replace these groups' identities with its own forms, principles, beliefs, and technologies of organization, or, put it plainly, they sought to colonize it. Colonization often targets lands. Without lands to conquer, Europe proceeded to colonize diverse Jewish ways of life, destroying this communitarian ontological resistance to Europe's devouring imperial secularism and dissolving their autonomy and internal organizational principles. The colonization of Jews, first in Europe and then in what is called North Africa and the Middle East, targeted and destroyed these diverse identities, forms of belonging, practices, and beliefs, subjecting them to a single law of Moses codified by Napoleon, which flattened the plurality of laws and practices they cherished. Europe had a clear interest in associating solutions to the Jewish problem only with the Nazi, so that the origins of the question in this colonial formation of Enlightenment Europe will be blurred. Other political formations seeking to repair the wounds and injustices caused by this dual imperial enterprise, the destruction of diverse forms of Jewish life and of Palestine, could have seen the light of day long ago. Each of these solutions to the Jewish question and the question of Palestine, invented and supported by Euro-American powers and imperial technologies, conceals the real issue that gave rise to these questions, Europe and the West at large. The signal to destroy Palestine was given by the imperial powers on November 29, 1947, when the resolution to partition Palestine was issued by the UN, against the majority of Palestinians inhabiting Palestine and against Jews around the world who had not chosen Zionist path. And let me show you three images. This is Beirut against partition, this is Baghdad against partition, and this is Cairo, protest against partition. In Cairo, Baghdad, Beirut, and Palestine, people protested against the UN resolution to partition Palestine. By then, they knew enough about European colonialism, sensing that what they were opposing was the genocidal violence without which the partitioning of Palestine could not be enforced. Only the colonially damaged perception and broken memories could mislead us into assuming that among these huge crowds appearing in those photos, there are not also many Jews, whose lives in those Jewish-Muslim worlds were entangled with anti-colonial struggles against the Zionist enterprise, which put them in danger. Here is what Cyril Shirzi, one of the founders of the Jewish Anti-Zionist League in Cairo, a group of anti-partition Arab Jewish activists, wrote in 1947, who may have been captured in, Cyril Shirzi himself, who may have been captured among protesters in Cairo. Jewish men, Jewish women, Zionism wants to throw us into a dangerous and hopeless adventure. Zionism contributes to making Palestine uninhabitable. Zionism wants to isolate us from the Egyptian people. Zionism is the enemy of the Jewish people. Down with Zionism, long live the brotherhood of Jews and Arabs. Long live the Egyptian people. And this is a photograph from a protest in Palestine, in Jerusalem, classified in Zionist archive as the beginning of the war for independence. It is actually an anti-partition protest led by Palestinians in Jerusalem. These are the last photographs of the world's European and Zionist colonialism destroyed. Jews can no longer be considered an innate part of their ancestral worlds, Cairo, Beirut, Baghdad, and other places. And Palestinians can no longer be considered guardians from within of their country, those who act as political subjects opposing a genocidal regime imposed by a minority. In further photographs taken between the sea and the river since the proclamation of the Zionist colony as an independent state, Jews and Palestinians are being assumed as enemies, while in fact they are inhabiting positions of colonizers and colonized, created for them by Europe and the United States. The role of the West in this genocidal history should be acknowledged before and beyond the current genocide in Gaza, in order for decolonization to be imagined all the way down to the colonial heritage of the Napoleonic Wars or even the Crusades and the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain. After the Second World War, Europe had no intention to undo and abolish the technologies that racialized and exterminated the Jews, along with several other groups. It rather sought to preserve and protect them with the help of international law and institutions. Nazi and Jews were exceptionalized to clear Europe's name and allow it to act as liberators and protectors of the Jews rather than as their perpetrators. This was only possible because of the conversion of the Holocaust into an example of incomparable universal suffering inflicted by an exceptional and incomparable enemy, so as to dispel the similarities and continuities with the genocidal technologies used by other European powers in their settlements and elsewhere, and by the State of Israel itself against Palestinians and Jews. To this day, this European racializing technology, compounded by its American variant, is leveraged to preserve the split between Jews and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs, Jews and Berbers, Jews and Muslims, as if these were mutually exclusive categories. All of you heard Lina Suleima coupling of the Jew and Muslims after they were bereft of their world. As if these were mutually exclusive categories, and to erase from memory the existence of a Jewish-Muslim world while nurturing the invention of a Judeo-Christian tradition which enabled Europe to be reborn as the savior of the Jews. We, Muslim Jews, Jews whose ancestors were uprooted and exiled from the world we used to share with Muslims, we oppose this reorganization of the world which forces us to be part of the Judeo-Christian world in which we are Jewish, in which we speak about Jewishness in its homogeneity vis-a-vis the Christian world, whose invented history is imposed on us once again by those who colonized us. Not only due to these colonial projects, we no longer live among Muslims, but we are captives of this invented Judeo-Christian tradition, which makes it hard to recall that from the very beginning of Islam, we lived in a shared world. Opening up the question of what Europe did to us, Jews, Arab, Muslims, Palestinians, is essential for the decolonization of Palestine, for redrawing the horizons of decolonization outside of the Western model. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ariella. I open the room for questions. We have about a little more than 20 minutes, so I will take two questions at a time. I see Annabel and I see Gil.
Thank you very much for your great papers. I have a question two very short questions to Anoush and then to Ariella. Anoush, could you say something could you compare very briefly the messianic theology, the political messianism that you described with the Jewish political messianism that we have, for instance, in Israel? And I have another question, very short question for you. When you hear Ariella's description of Europe from your Iranian point of view, what do you think? So that's...
Which point?
From Iran. From
which point?
Oh, choose. You can choose. Now I have a very, very short question to Ariella. I mean, a great paper that resonates with me because of part of the history of my family is totally connected to what you describe. So my first very short question is how do you relate to what Derrida wrote in Monolinguism, which is totally in echo with what you said, and his description of his relationship to Algeria and the language and everything. Second, very short question. You mentioned that Arendt used anti-colonial language, but she also, in her letters to Jaspers of the same time, was extremely racist against the Mizrahi Jews. So how do you combine the two things? Third, very, very short question. Algeria is populated today by 24% of Berbers whose language is not Arabic and who feel they have been conquered by the Arabs. And Morocco by 33% of Berbers who feel they have been conquered by Arabs. So how do you, and their language cannot, I mean, very recently they have a right to use their language, but that's recent of the last 10 years. And very last question, you show the picture and you say that these are my ancestors, and they had the cover, the hats of the Ottoman Empire because they had been conquered by the Ottoman Empire. So how do you relate to the fact that this entire region had been very violently conquered much earlier by the Ottoman Empire, and before that by the Arabs?
And now, second question by Gil.
So yesterday there was a procedural moment which I thought should have been transformed, because when something happens that requires a change of procedure, then it should happen. The procedure should change. I feel like something like this is happening again, where we need a few centuries to actually discuss the two papers. This time I would want independently. But let's summarize my question, which is for both of you, with the question of geography. Ariella, you actually said that the production of the Jewish people is a colonial Zionist enterprise, and yet you kept using the something that, by the way, I completely endorse. When people ask, who are you to say we? White man usually. I'm always asking myself, who am I to say I? Why is I a more acceptable pronoun than we? So I want to say that I endorse the we that you used, but every time you identified it with the term identity, Algerian Jews, etc., I want to ask about the place of history. There's something about wound that has become historicist. The veracity of history is predicated on a recognizable wound and on the articulation of a language to speak of that wound. And I'm wondering, what is the messianic hope that we put in historiography? And I ask this because it's also a geographical question. And I know it's the wrong question to ask you, Anoush. I want to read your paper now for a few years, but does the geography of the thinkers you mentioned, the three thinkers you mentioned, does it matter? You said the Islamic tradition, and I don't want to push too much of what I think is a much touted opposition between Shia and Sunnah, but I'm wondering whether you want to say something about this.
Okay, so now both of you, please take a few minutes to answer, and then we'll move to the other questions.
Thank you very much for your questions. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to start with Annabel's very interesting question, and that was actually our discussion for years with Elad and other Jewish friends. I think in order to have a kind of comparative vision about what happened through the encounter of Jewish and Islamic messianism with modernity, it is a necessary project to compare two, for me, essential thinkers, Khomeini and Rav Kook. Exactly the same program. Khomeini didn't know Hegel, but he was a... So for years and years, I tried to convince my European, Western interlocutors, even Arab thinkers, my colleagues, that Khomeini was not a faqih. He wasn't just a guy like Daesh. He was a philosopher. He has a very accurate knowledge about Islamic philosophy and also the Islamic version of Greek philosophy. You know, for years and years, he taught Plato's and Aristotle's philosophy, physics, and so on and so on. I think that that's why Lina is not here, but I think that it's a completely a false approach and a wrong idea. We should compare Jewish tradition and Islamic tradition because several things. Structural affinities, but specifically because a shared history. And I insist for modernity, because if you read in a comparative way, even Muslim Arab nationalism and Zionism, you can have another idea about what happened after 19th century. So my point of view about Ariella, two things. One thing I appreciate this kind of, to be honest, if I'm invited for two conferences, one with Muslim scholars, another with Jewish scholars, I would hesitate for the first one, but not for the second one. Why? Because I want to have this kind of dialogue, and also I appreciate this kind of self-criticism, which is absent among us, Iranians, Arabs, Turkish thinkers, and so on. So the first thing I appreciate is this kind of self-criticism. But the second thing, I would be a little bit nuanced or critical. Okay, we are friends, we are cousins, but maybe we don't need to idealize the past. We should be, for the beginning of a solution, we should be a little bit realistic. For Gil questions, I'm going to be quick. Yes, I agree with you. Geography is a very important question, but Islamic thought geography is the Middle East. Ideas are circulating. We have a very big problem today to address the Islamic thought in general, but specifically theological political thought in Islamic tradition, is this kind of wrong separation as a starting point between Shia and Sunnah. Never Muslim thinkers considered themselves like this isolated. Ideas are circulating, differentiating from both sides, but there is a kind of continuous dialogue. I mentioned three thinkers. The two first are Sunni. The last one is Shia. So I think that in order to have a accurate reading of Islamic tradition, we should bring together two parts and to read them through this kind of internal dialogue. Please, Ariella.
Yeah, thank you, Annabel and Gil, for these questions, and also I will respond to your comment. My reply will be somehow, to the three questions together, or to the one comment and three questions. So I'll start maybe with you, because It's not about idealizing this world. And we are not friends. I think that we heard a wonderful lecture about friendship, and we are not friends. I just met you today. So it's not about we are friends. It's about we had a shared world together since the beginning of Islam until the colonization of the Middle East and North Africa and the colonization of Palestine. And this world, without idealizing it, it existed, and Jews were innate to the Islamic nation. For centuries. Today, we are the product of those colonial projects which pushes us into thinking about reconciling. So you ask me, you tell me, in order to start to have a beginning of a solution, my attempt, and here I start to reply also to Gil, my attempt is to counter the discipline of history, which is, in a sense, create a science fictional world from which I have to speak. What is this I? What is this I that I have to speak from? I was born in the Zionist colony in Palestine. At my birth, an identity was imposed on me, barely 1 decade and few years after this identity was crafted, and I had to recognize myself in this identity. So part of reclaiming being Jewish, Algerian Jew or Palestinian Jew is against this science fictional identity that created a world in which this identity resonated. When I'm being interviewed, people ask me, but what does it mean, Algerian Jew or Palestinian Jew? They don't ask, what does it mean, an Israeli Jew? It seems normalized to them, but this is science fiction. Why it is science fiction? Because historian, the discipline of history, is a colonial and imperial discipline that turns any campaign of colonial and imperial violence into a fait accompli, in a sense, not only that we have to accept it in our bodies, but we also have to build all our thinking on the basis of what was achieved with violence. So what I'm doing is trying to write a potential history. So when I'm saying I'm a Palestinian Jew and I am an Algerian Jew, it is not only a term to designate an identity. I have no idea what is identity, actually. But I know that I cannot continue to normalize the state of Israel through my body. And I know that being an anti-Zionist is only one aspect of my being. The other aspect is reclaiming what was stolen from me. And what was stolen from me is somehow, can be designated by I am an Algerian Jew, I am a Palestinian Jew, but it's not my identity. My identity, I don't know what it is. It's actually an attempt to potentialize history that we will start to make possible what was made into extinct species, and we will also refuse to reconcile. I don't have to reconcile with any Arab or Muslim or Palestinian. I have responsibility for the crimes that were done in my name as long as I live there. I have responsibility toward them even today. But it's not about us reconciling. It's about us reclaiming our shared histories without idealizing them. So the reconciliation is part of the language of solutions to the problems that we posed to Europe as the Jewish people and as Palestine. And these are identities that I'm trying, to speak through them, are identities that I'm using in order to challenge this historiography that made them impossible through this kind of science fiction that becomes reality. And Annabel, to your question, so first, again, I think that we cannot think about exile, we cannot think about, the colonization of Palestine without colonial terms. We cannot speak about Algeria without colonial terms. So again, without idealizing Algeria in the last 2 years of the war to decolonize Algeria, Algerians were schooled in an accelerated school by the French through the Evian Accord. This is why they let the Jews go. So we were not expelled by Algerians, we were expelled by the French. But in 1 year after the decolonization, they legislated the nation law, which made it, Arab and Muslim, which made Algeria Arab and Muslim. Now coming to your statistic about 24% of Berbers and 33% of... Before the French colonization, people didn't identify them as part of... they didn't recognize themselves in this percentage, which is totally false. I think that, the Maghreb was Berberian, and everybody has some blood, some Berberian blood, some Jewish blood, I mean, there is a mixture there. So I think that these identities that are telling that Berberian, they have their struggle they are struggling against the becoming of the decolonized Algerian state, a Muslim and Arab state. But prior to the colonization, the relationship between Arabs and Berbers were totally different. And again, vis-a-vis the Ottoman Empire, without idealizing the Ottoman Empire, I think that it was not as total as the European imperial projects that is based on destruction. As Augils described it yesterday, you break two eggs and make an omelette and you cannot bring back the eggs, but you can reverse many other things in order to reconstruct the eggs. And what I'm trying to do is to, again, Nono accused me being nostalgic yesterday, wanting to call the past again. I don't call it past. Past is the most successful imperial invention that educate us to relate to everything that imperial crimes did as if it belonged to the past. So in this sense, yes, I reclaim the past and I inhabit the past, but for me, it's not the past. For me, all these imperial crimes are still things that we have to attend to and reclaim other options. As for Derrida, I must say that I don't want to read Derrida in the context of my work, and there are better scholars here in the room to speak about Derrida and what I am doing. I felt when I read Derrida, it's not from this point that I would like to think. Is too Republican for me when it comes to Algeria. But I'm unfair to him because I didn't, spend the necessary time, as you said, as a scholar, to read these texts when I delved into the project of the Jewelers of the Ummah, because I felt that it limits me rather than opening ways for me. I think that I replied to all the questions.
Okay, we have 2 questions now. Please keep them short, if you will. And in the responses also try to keep them short because there is lunch waiting for us and I don't want to starve people. Shaul and then Agata.
So, very quickly, I want to cede my time to Abir, but I just want to say one thing first, is that there's a young scholar named Ezra Tsarfati who did write a dissertation on Khomeini and Rav Kook and has a Jewish theology workshop. So that work has already been done. But Abir?
Agata is now on the list.
Well, so I just want to cede my time.
Oh, you want to cede your time? That's nice. Okay.
Yeah,
please. Please.
Oh, okay. I have. I am an obsessive translator from Arabic to other languages, and I wonder why you, Anoush, decided to either translate or rely on a translation of ghurba, as exile. Because I think that when we translate exile, we translate it to manfa. And exiled is manfi. And ghurba is completely, I think that ghurba is not exile. Ghurba is the state of being a stranger in somebody else's homeland. This is ghurba. For my parents, I am not a refugee here. I didn't come across the Mediterranean, almost drowning. So here sometimes people ask me, are you a Palestinian refugee? I say no. So are you in diaspora? I also say no. So what are you? And when I want to say that from my immediate context point of view, أنا بالغربة, أنا غريبة. Or according to my family's expression, أنا غريبة بلاد. So I'm in somebody else's blood, somebody else's homeland. I'm the stranger inside somebody else's homeland. And this is completely different context of exile. And it bothered me. And then I started thinking about the word ghurba, and then somehow it was connected to Ariella's talk, what Europe did to us. And I think that this is one of the things that Europe did to us. It changed our language, because ghurba comes from the root gharaba, and we use this root sometimes as parallel to sharaka,
because it's Gharb, west, and Sharq, east, and Maghreb is the far west of Arab entity. But somehow the root Sharaqa did not was not developed in terms and the concept of exile or being a stranger.
Which Sharq?
Sharq, there is no Shariq, but there is Gharib.
Yes.
Abir, we need to.
What I want to
answer.
say is that this is one thing that Europe did to us. I think that they changed our language because when we go west, we are strangers and we are exiled and we are in diaspora. The same thing when they think of the Orient, they are Orientalists and there is Orientalism, but there is no Occidental or Occidentalism. So this is basically, I think that this is just the direction of both our dynamics, us and Europe, and we are always in exile among them, whether it's Boyarin's diaspora or Shaul's exile.
I think that Agatha.
Thank you. So we have 1 hour and a half lunch. You can deal with that. So please, Anoush and Ariella.
Yes, so I feel like it's not really. I feel like it's not really a question to me, but I would like to engage with what you said, and I would like to refer maybe to allude to Nitzan's lecture about, when he mentioned Hebrew and in general to Hebrew. I was born to believe that Hebrew is my mother tongue. This is the language that my mother talked to me. But my mother was not loved by her mother in Hebrew. My mother was loved by her mother in Ladino. And I knew that my father, it was not his mother tongue because he had a very broken Hebrew, but he was loved in French and in Arabic. So the language that I grew up to believe that is mine is Hebrew as a mother tongue. And not only that, I grew up on the myth that this language went through a renaissance. But this language was actually invented against us, that we will believe that we are Israeli. So we are actually speaking about an Israeli language in which when the subject is Israeli, the object must be a Palestinian. When the subject is Palestinian, the object must be an Israeli. And why it is an Israeli language and not Hebrew? Because Hebrew didn't need to be revived. It was used everywhere as part of other languages. So we had many, many, many Hebrew in different places in the world to which we belonged. And what the Zionists did, they cleaned the language, they invented few words, and they obliterated, like we did delete in the computer, all the memories that were transmitted through the Hebrew that was entangled in all the other languages. So I totally agree with you. Colonialism actually deprived us of the memories of resistance of our parents that went through their entangled languages. And it's not only about Yiddish and Ladino that we lost. This is why I started with the loss of the Arabic as a Jewish language, but it's even not the Arabic. It's the Judeo-Libyan, the Judeo-Algerian, the Judeo-Mazebian, the Judeo, etc., etc.
So they made you a stranger to your Arabic. Mm-hmm. And there is a lot of variation of this root which have never really existed in Sharq.
So may I,
Anoush, last comment? No, not a question. Last words, and then we need to end the panel.
Yeah. Okay, no, answer. I'm sorry. Your comment, you're right, your comment is relevant, but at the best of my knowledge, general answer first, at the best of my knowledge, Manfi is relatively modern. I mean, in the classical... I think
that Manfi is the secular version.
So that's not my concern here. So I recommend the reading of the first and second, specifically, treaties. There is, you're right, a connection in Arabic, very interesting. That's the key point between Qarb, east, west, sorry, Qurba. this is a central point to develop something, the idea that we are only in home in the East, which is a metaphysical East, it is not a geographical.
Thank you very much, Ariella and Anoush. Speakers and moderators are invited to join us for lunch downstairs. 3 o'clock, we have a concluding discussion.